Good morning, everyone. Welcome to today's hearing. Today we're going to hear evidence from Dame Melanie Dawes, who was formerly the Permanent Secretary of the Department for Local Government. So, Ms. Grange.
Yes, could we have Dame Melanie Dawes, please?
Good morning, Dame Melanie. I understand you wish to affirm.
Yes.
The words should be on the screen in front of you. Could you read them out, please?
Yes. I do solemnly, sincerely and truly declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you very much. Please sit down and make yourself comfortable. Right. Thank you very much. Yes, Ms. Grange.
Yes, thank you. Yes, good morning, Dame Melanie. Can I start by thanking you for attending this public inquiry to give your evidence today? It is very much appreciated. If you have any difficulty understanding any of the questions I'm going to ask you, just ask me to repeat the question or I'll put the point in a different way. If you can also keep your voice up and not speak too fast, there's the lady there transcribing all of your evidence sitting to your right so that we can get a nice clear note for the transcript. Now, you've provided 3 witness statements to the inquiry. We'll only be looking at your first and third statements for the purposes of your evidence today. You'll be taken to your second statement and in detail to your first statement when you return to give evidence in Module 4, which deals with the aftermath of the fire. Now, if I can ask you to start with looking at your first witness statement, it appears at CLG 3030653. There's your first statement, and if we look at page 39 of that, we can see it's dated the 20th of May 2019, and is that your signature there?
Yes, it is.
And have you read that statement recently?
Yes.
And are the contents of that true?
Yes.
Thank you. And in terms of your third witness statement, which is the one we'll go to quite a few times today, that appears at CLG 3030839. There we have that. If you could look at page 24 of that, there we can see it's dated the 20th of April 2021. And is that your electronic signature this time?
Yes, it is.
Thank you. And have you read that third witness statement recently?
Yes.
And are the contents true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
Yes.
Thank you. And have you discussed the evidence you're going to give today with anybody before coming here?
With my legal team, obviously, yes. And inevitably, when I was at the department, quite a lot of the time we were talking about these issues.
Yes, I understand. Thank you. Now, I want to start by asking you some questions about your background. Is it right that you graduated with a Bachelor of Arts degree from Oxford University? Is that
Yes.
correct? And when was that? When did you get your degree?
1987.
And in what subject?
Philosophy, politics and economics.
So PPE?
Yes.
Thank you. And you then undertook postgraduate studies in economics at Birkbeck College in London, is that correct?
Yes, it is.
And you graduated with a Master of Science degree from Birkbeck?
Yes.
Thank you. And is it right that you joined the civil service in 1989?
Yes, that's correct.
Was that your first job, or had you done anything else prior to joining the civil service after carrying out your studies?
It was my first proper job. I briefly worked for law firms a little bit and then decided to pursue a career in the civil service as an economist.
Yes. Yes, and coming on to that, is it right that you started your career very much as a civil servant, as an economist, and you worked on public spending, tax and tax credit policy, macroeconomics, monetary policy, and the euro?
Yes,
is that a fair
correct.
summary?
Yes.
Thank you.
I was in the Treasury for the first decade or so of my career.
Yes. Is it right that you began working in the Department of Transport for 2 years?
Yes.
And then you spent 15 years at HM Treasury?
Yes.
Thank you. And is it right that during that time you were the Europe Director from 2002 to 2006?
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you. And then between 2006 and 2011 you worked for Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs. Is this right, including as one of the department's commissioners?
Yes.
And you were the Director General for Business Tax from November 2007?
Yes, that's correct.
And then between October 2011 and 2015, you were the Director General of the Economic and Domestic Secretariat in the Cabinet Office.
Yes.
Thank you. Now, you took on the role as Permanent Secretary for the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, shortened as MHCLG, in March 2015. Is that correct?
Yes, it is.
And you were in that role until February 2020, when you became Chief Executive of Ofcom. Is that right?
Yes,
And do you remain Chief Executive of Ofcom today?
I do.
Thank you. Now, focusing on your role as Permanent Secretary, if we could look at paragraph 5, page 2 of your first witness statement. And there you tell us this. You say, as Permanent Secretary, I am the Civil Service Head of the Ministry of Housing, Communities and Local Government, hereinafter the Department. I took up my role on the 1st of March 2015. With my senior team, referred to as the executive team, I am responsible for the overall leadership and management of the department. Our primary aims are to support our ministers in the achievement of their objectives and to oversee the effective day-to-day running of the department. In addition, as Principal Accounting Officer, I am responsible to Parliament for the effective stewardship of the department's resources and for ensuring value for money. As a member of the wider Permanent Secretary team, including the Civil Service Board, I'm also part of the collective leadership of the Civil Service. So obviously when you wrote that statement, you were still in post at that time, hence in the present tense. And if we can look at paragraph 9 of this statement as well on page 4, you tell us this. You say, immediately prior to the fire at Grenfell Tower, the department employed 1,424 people, equivalent to 1,375 on a full-time basis. The majority of the department's employees were spread across 3 broad commands, each led by a Director General, covering housing and planning, that was Helen McNamara, local government and public services, that was Joe Farah, and local economic growth and devolution, Simon Ridley. In addition, 3 director-led commands oversaw corporate activities, including finance, that was Jacinda Humphrey, human resources, Christine Hewitt, and strategy, Lise-Anne Boisser. The department had 5 ministers, 2 of whom had been newly appointed following the general election of the 8th of June 2017. Yes? And those 2 new ministers who had been appointed following the general election were Alok Sharma and Jake Perry. Is that correct?
Jake Berry, yes.
Yes, thank you. Now, as Permanent Secretary and Civil Service Head of MHCLG, how did you ensure that you were able to provide leadership to the 3 main work streams that you described there, those 3 broad commands?
Yes, I had a number of processes and systems in place to discharge my leadership of the department with my team. And if it helps, I can go through those now.
Please just summarise those.
So, I mean, the first thing to say is that when I arrived, it was almost the beginning of a new parliament. So a lot of what I had to do in the first 6 to 9 months was really make sure we had our priorities set as a department ready for what we thought would be a 4 or 5 year parliament, although in the end it was a lot shorter than that. So the first thing was business planning, and we conducted a pretty exhaustive exercise during the winter of 2015-16 to establish priorities and work out how to meet a reduced budget that we'd been given in the spending review. And then what I put in place during 2016, and they were in place by the autumn of that year, was portfolio boards, so that each of the 3 Director Generals had a board that met monthly with their directors, where all of the work that they were supposed to do in their area, as identified through our planning exercises, and adapted as ministers made different decisions as we went along, was overseen by those boards. And that was a place that directors and DGs in those areas were discussing, with the support of metrics and data and information, about everything, what was on track, how things were going, what risks there were, and so on.
Yes.
And then the executive team met fortnightly, I recall, and the departmental board about once a quarter. And we met with the non-executives separately alongside that as a senior team without ministers as well. And that was where we looked at the overview of the department's risks. We particularly focused in the executive team on the corporate side because a lot of the work was being managed via ministers. So that was the appropriate way to be escalating and dealing with issues on the policy and delivery side, was mainly through ministerial meetings rather than through the executive team.
Yeah.
But we nonetheless had an opportunity to bring up anything on the policy side that needed it into those meetings. So that's a beginning of a description of some of the systems I had in place at the departmental level.
Sorry, yes. No, carry on.
No, I've concluded for the moment.
And would each Director General feed back to you about what their boards were doing on a regular basis?
Yes, so when I arrived, the system we had in place in 2015 was very much the end of the Parliament, so it was very focused at quite a detailed level, the system for the department as a whole, on quite detailed tracking of mostly quite small remaining deliverables over the remaining weeks of the Parliament. And that was a system that was overseen by the Secretary of State himself weekly in meetings with the Permanent Secretary and the senior team. And it was very top-down. I think it was appropriate given where we were and the stage of the Parliament, but it wasn't very empowering to the rest of the department, and it wasn't, to my mind, structured enough and devolved enough to allow for proper oversight right down through the line and the proper channels of communication to be going up and down as things change. So the portfolio boards were set up in response to that. And then we had a departmental plan. I can't remember when the first one was published. There might not have been one in place for 2016-17, but there certainly was in the years after that. Which set out all the things we were supposed to achieve, and I would talk to my Director Generals bilaterally at least once a fortnight, and we would talk about how things were going, what issues there were, if any, that they wanted to escalate with me, we would take it from there.
Yeah, I understand. And was your time split evenly across those three broad commands that you described there, or in the time that you were Permanent Secretary, was one or other of those more of a priority, had more of a heavy workload that demanded more of your time?
I think my own time was split pretty evenly. I think from the government's point of view, housing and planning was where they were expecting to make the most impact in policy terms. That's pretty much always the case in what was then MHCLG. The other big area that was growing at the time was devolution and local growth. And in fact, I'd set up a new DG command under Simon Ridley to deal with that quite early in the new Parliament.
Yeah.
The local government side is a bit more about system oversight. It's less about delivering policy objectives. There were some areas in there that were important political priorities as well, but it was more about risk management and oversight and the delivery of certain programmes such as Troubled Families Programme and a few others.
Yeah. Now, focusing on housing and planning, you've talked about these fortnightly meetings with your Director Generals. Would you meet any more frequently than that with Helen McNamara, the Director General for Housing and Planning?
Yes, I would see my DGs pretty much every day, and we would start the week on a Monday morning with a meeting of the executive team for half an hour just to discuss what was going on that week. And we followed that every week with a meeting of all directors and the executive team where directors would go around the table, say what was going on, and that was the chance for anything to be raised every single week. I also led meetings once a week of the whole of the department's senior civil service on a Thursday morning. That was something my predecessor had introduced. I think it was really good practice. And that was usually talking about corporate issues, but sometimes we touched on policy issues. And again, its main purpose was really just to bring everyone together, to provide an opportunity for people to have a chat in the corridor, pick things up, tap each other on the shoulder about something they were worried about. So there were, in any department like that, you're relying on systems and processes, but you're also relying, certainly in my case, on my antennae always being out there to talk to people, and quite a lot of interactions.
Yeah.
So not a static kind of method of communication at all.
Yeah. And when you said you had these meetings with all of the senior civil service, just help us, what qualifies as a senior civil servant for the purposes of that?
So that's deputy director and above. So, for example, it would include Mr. Leadsom, who is head of the Building Regulations and Energy Performance team.
Yes.
And it included at the time about 70 to 80 people. That included all those deputy directors plus about 20 or slightly more directors, and then the 3 director generals and me.
Yeah.
That number grew after the fire, but at the time it was a bit smaller.
Yeah. So I think you just answered my question. In terms of directors, it sounds like you did have these regular meetings with, for example, with the Building Regulations Division, which became the Building Regulation and Energy Performance Division. We know that Sally Randall was the director, and then Steve Quartermain from mid-2016, yes?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah. And in terms of those deputy directors that were part of the senior civil service, where you say you did have these meetings with up to 70 to 80 people, did you ever meet in smaller groups with the deputy directors? And if so, in what circumstances?
So I would also have meetings on individual topics very regularly, and the choice of those topics would be driven in the first instance by what were the department's big priorities. So what were the big things that were in the manifesto or that were top of the government's list, and on those sorts of issues, and there were about 20 or so top priorities that were identified during the first business planning round that I mentioned earlier. I had a number of meetings on those over the first 6 to 9 months, and I set up an implementation unit to make sure that all of those programmes were set up properly, to give them support, and those were quite detailed meetings with the deputy directors, but also very much their team members as well, talking about what were they worried about, what were they really aiming to achieve, what were their risks, was there anything I could do to help, what were issues with other government departments that might need brokering or pushing. So that was on the big priority areas. Yeah. The building regulations wasn't one of those.
I was about to ask that.
And I don't recall having a meeting with Mr. Leadsom and his team, certainly in the first few years before the fire, on that work specifically.
Yeah.
I had a meeting on the red tape challenge, but not on the building regulations work.
Not on that. And just give us a flavour of what the main areas of work were for the Housing and Planning Department during the period 2015 to 2017 when you were the permanent secretary.
Well, in the first year before the Brexit referendum, when we had effectively a change of government and a new set of priorities, in that first year, we had to take forward some pretty big manifesto commitments. There was a Housing and Planning Act that was going through Parliament. I think it was enacted in May 2016. And that included some very ambitious proposals to extend the right to buy to housing association tenants, which weren't in the legislation but which were being dealt with alongside as part of a deal with the sector. They were quite challenging, and they were supposed to be funded by sales of social housing by local authorities, and that was provided for in the legislation, was also quite technically difficult and operationally would have been very difficult. Neither of those two have really been taken forward since. So those were really big, challenging policies. There were also proposals for what was called the pay to stay, which was to require tenants of social housing who were on higher incomes to pay more on top of their discounted social rent if they were on those higher incomes. That was another government policy at the time. And then more broadly, and this continued throughout, and was more the focus of Theresa May's administration when she became Prime Minister, there was house building, and that was always, during my time in the department, and I think it has been forever and probably always will be, house building, getting the numbers up. Reforming the planning system. So there were lots of policies there, modern methods of construction and the sale of public sector land. So there were lots of programmes that sort of added up towards that overall objective as well.
Yes, thank you. Now, what about the Building Regulations Division within the Housing and Planning Department? Were you aware of what their priorities and challenges were in that period, 2015 to 2017?
So I recall that during the business planning exercise of the winter of 2015-16, which we started just after the spending review in November 2015, and it ran through till about March 2016, I recall then talking to Sally Randall about all of the work that she had identified needed to be done by her directorate and by the teams in her area. And what we did was go through everything. I was very concerned to ensure that while we focused, and while a lot of my personal effort was focused on mobilising ministers' priorities, I was very concerned that we didn't miss things which were below the radar, which might be more technical and which might not get the attention they needed. So that's why we did this exercise over several months, and it was led by directors. And there were multiple spreadsheets mapping all of the different areas of the department's work for whatever reason. And what we had to decide, because we had a 25% budget cut to meet, was where we were maintaining or increasing resources, which was largely only on big new government priorities, where we were stopping work in order to free up time, and where we were maintaining the work but going to have to do it with fewer people, and perhaps that meant scaling back some of the work as well. And my recollection talking to Sally was that we talked about the building regulations in that latter category. The work needs to continue, but we're going to have to scale some of it back. And we didn't go into any particular detail on it. And in fact, I recall the conversation being as much about energy performance and that being one of the priorities. And of course, the whole thing was done in the context of the Red Tape Challenge as well. But I don't remember any discussion about the work on approved document B, as I said in my witness statement.
Yes, no, I understand that. In terms of your effective day-to-day running of the department, did that include ensuring public commitments made by the department were delivered within the timescales that had been promised?
Yes, and it should have done. I'm still surprised that I didn't know about the Lakanal House fire or the coroner's recommendations, and there was no system to flag those kinds of recommendations in the department.
Yes.
And I think every department should have one of those systems. There was one for recommendations from the Public Accounts Committee called the Treasury Minute System, but there was nothing to flag recommendations like that. And given the nature of that inquiry and the nature of those recommendations, I think that was a serious oversight and was one of the contributing factors as to why that work was not progressed. So I was relying on my directors, their deputy directors, knowing the work. There were quite a lot of processes that allowed them to, flag it at the planning stage, but also then in the portfolio oversight that came later. And I was also relying on the experience, to be honest, of my directors and my Director General on Housing, Peter Schofield, in that first year. He'd been in the department since 2012, and I relied heavily on his judgment and knowledge because he'd been there a while, and he was an extremely strong individual and very effective.
Yeah. We'll come back to some of that
Yes.
later in your evidence. But just for now, was there a formalised handover process when you were appointed? So we know you took over from Sir Bob Kerslake. Was there a formal handover that you went through when you took on the new role?
It was quite a rushed process. Bob's departure was at the very end of February, and I spent the month of February in the department, getting briefed up, meeting teams, going out and meeting external stakeholders as well. And then there was only a month before the general election was called, in fact slightly less than a month, before we were into election planning. So the department did put in place briefings on key topics, mostly the sort of ministerial priorities, but also things like departmental finance, local government finance, and a few other issues. But the moment I arrived, we were really in the thick of planning for the general election, which at the time was very uncertain in the polls. And as always for MHCLG, as then was, housing was going to be right at the top of the agenda, and the Labour government priorities on housing were very different from the Conservative manifesto proposals. So we had to prepare for two extremely different scenarios.
Yeah.
And so that was my dominant work. And that was really one of the ways in which I got up to speed and got to know people, was through that planning work that we did in April and May during the election campaign.
Yeah, I understand. Were you given any form of briefing about the building regulations or the systems of building control, even generally, during that handover process?
Not that I can recall, no.
Do you think, looking back, you perhaps should have been, so that you had some, at least overall awareness of how the system worked broadly, what its objectives were, how it worked, what the department's role was?
With the benefit of hindsight and following the Grenfell Tower fire, then yes. I think that, when I asked colleagues about this at the time, shortly after the fire, there was an awful lot to get through. And so while with hindsight, I wish I had had a briefing on those issues, obviously, I'm not that surprised that the department didn't prioritise it, because it was seen as quite a technical exercise.
Yeah.
But I do think that, and it may be that I was given some introductory information, but I don't recall it, so I don't think I had a meeting on it, for example.
Yeah.
I do think that should have been included, yes, a sense of what the department's responsibilities were, what its role was, the nature of the regime, its history, and so on.
Yeah, yeah. Let me ask you some questions now about what you did know when you were... and these questions are all focusing on the time before the Grenfell Tower fire. I appreciate you underwent a very detailed process of educating yourself after the Grenfell Tower fire, but I want to focus on what you knew before that. And so first of all, to what extent during your time as Permanent Secretary did you become familiar with the building regulations, just in general, and the system for building control in England and Wales?
So, apart from the conversation I described earlier with Sally Randall about prioritisation, the other conversation I remember is an introduction to the department's commitments on the red tape challenge. And I think that took place in the first few months of 2016. And the reason for that was that I was, like all permanent secretaries, going to be grilled by the business secretary that summer on what the department was doing. And so I had a preparatory meeting for that, a first preparatory meeting. And because of the referendum, that meeting never took place. The meeting with the Secretary of State never took place. But I had a first overview conversation with Stephen Aldridge, the Director of Analysis, about the sorts of things that were in scope, some of the history, and some of the challenges that the department would face in meeting those objectives. And I don't specifically remember the general building regulations work. I remember a conversation about energy efficiency, and that being a conflict potentially with red tape challenge. And I remember forming the impression that we were going to have to argue quite hard that we couldn't meet the budget that we had been set. But in the end, I only had the one meeting because the need for it wasn't there after the referendum, and the pressure on red tape was significantly reduced after the referendum.
Yes. Did you know that the statutory scheme around the building regulations involved the imposition of overarching functional or performance requirements? Did you know that much?
I don't recall being talked through how the system worked at that level, no, not before the fire.
Yeah. Did you have any understanding about what the overarching aim of the building regulations was? If you'd been asked, well, what is the aim of the building regulations? What's it there to do? What would you have said?
I would have said that it was to ensure safety, but also to ensure performance of buildings in areas like energy efficiency, for example.
Yeah.
That's what I would have assumed.
Yeah. Had you heard of the approved documents, and that these were for the purposes of providing practical guidance with respect to the provisions in the building regulations?
I don't believe I had, no. I had heard about the enforcement side. Perhaps we'll come on to that, but I had heard more about how the local government end worked.
Right, yes. Did you ever ask, or were you ever told about the systems in place for keeping the building regulations and any associated guidance under review? Did you ever have any briefings about that?
No, I don't believe I did.
Did you know anything about how the department sought to keep up to date with current practices and trends in the building industry, including methods of construction, to be able to issue practical guidance in relation to it?
No, I wasn't aware of what we were doing from the building regulations side on that. I was aware of what the department was aiming to achieve by way of more widespread take-up of modern methods of construction. And that was really focused on what one might call kit housing that's produced in factories and is very, very much quicker to assemble on site and speeds up the process of house building and can also be very cost effective. So not modern methods such as cladding, but more that kind of factory built, actually usually rather accurate and well-produced housing. And that was an emerging industry at the time, still is, I think, and we had a number of programmes to try to support it. So that was the context in which I was aware of those sorts of developments across the industry and what the department was thinking about, but I don't recall anyone ever raising any concerns that there might be safety issues about some of that innovation.
Yes. Who was the person that would have told you about this push for kit housing, as you've just described it? Where would you be getting that information from?
Well, that was one of the government's priorities. I mean, it wasn't perhaps one of the top 10 or 15, but it was one of the next tier of things we were trying to do to speed up house building, encourage more finance into the industry, and generally build more homes.
Yes. And going back to what you said a moment ago, why do you think building regulations was not a priority area at that time? Who had decided that?
I mean, it's a question to which I've given a lot of thought over the last 5 years, and I'm still not quite sure I know the answer. I mean, my overall impression here, and I'm sure we'll come on to this, is that the department just didn't see that it had a role of oversight of that system. It saw that its role was one of writing the rules, and it understood that there was a role for local government to do by way of approvals and enforcement. But everything else in the middle that you do when you're performing regulatory oversight, and that I do today through Ofcom, wasn't, I believe, understood by the department as something that needed to be done or as something that needed to be done by the department.
Yes.
So in that sense, had I been briefed on the regulations, I think it would have been to be informed on the work that we were doing
Yes.
to change the rules, to make them easier to understand, etc., rather than to be informed of a wider statutory system, because I don't think the department for many decades saw that as a role that it had or a role that needed performing.
Yeah. And do you think that perhaps had you known that the department's practice was to produce this practical guidance to assist people to comply with the building regulations, had you known that, do you think you perhaps might have appreciated that it did have an ongoing role in terms of oversight, to some extent, of that regime, even if not at the enforcement end?
Well, I might have done, but I think it would be rather self-serving of me to say that I would have done when nobody else had done for several decades, to be honest. It was very far from the way the department saw its role. I think we know that since the fire. It was what I felt when I began to explore the history immediately after the fire. I mean, because I had been at HMRC and had been responsible for systems of compliance, I did actually have and was rather passionate about how you go about ensuring not just that the rules are right and that enforcement takes place, but all those things in the middle about how people understand that they're responsible for filling in a tax return, making sure a building has been put up properly, where does the training come from, who are the experts, who are the advisors, you know, and on tax it's the accountants, on building safety it's architects and engineers. And I did actually have an appreciation of those issues. I think that was a relatively, in fact, it's a very unusual background for a permanent secretary in a Whitehall department. So maybe I might have asked some wider questions, but I think I am, you know, I would be being, as I say, somewhat self-serving if I think I might have managed to discover something that nobody else had discovered for several decades.
Yes. Do you think that one of the explanations for why it wasn't more at the forefront was because it was seen as very technical and complex? Do you think that in itself meant that it ended up standing apart from perhaps the mainstream in terms of what people were aware of?
Yes, I think that, to be honest, these systems of regulatory oversight don't sit very well in government departments whose main focus is to serve the democratically elected government of the day. And that focus is correct. I mean, it's extremely important, particularly for very policy-focused departments like MHCLG. And I think that sits quite awkwardly with the sort of long-term, risk-based oversight that you need to oversee a regulatory system, particularly one that's about public safety.
Yeah.
And I can say a bit more about that if it's helpful. But I do think one of the aspects of that is skills.
Yeah.
So it's partly that those skills are not as necessary for the ministerial work that you do, and therefore they are sometimes undervalued, and I think the team probably did feel a bit undervalued. I think also it's quite hard to attract those skills into a government department.
Yeah.
And it's much easier to attract them and value them and reward them in a regulator where it's a dedicated and, proud and central part of what those regulators do. So I think the skills bit is one piece of it, but it's for me part of a wider whole about the nature of the work of a government department and what is and is not easy to do alongside that.
Yes. Now, at the time, did you know anything about the work done by technical policy officers, including as a link to industry, effectively feeding back information from industry and then enabling the building regulations and the guidance that was issued pursuant to it to be kept up to date, to be current, to be fit for purpose? Did you know about the role of those technical policy officers?
No, I didn't.
Did you know, well, it must follow that you didn't know, therefore, that they also had a role in terms of what's called horizon scanning to anticipate new developments in the construction industry, which might impact on the work of the department, but also might impact on the building regulations and the guidance given pursuant to it?
No, I wasn't aware of that.
Had you ever met with technical policy officers before the Grenfell Tower fire?
I don't believe that I met members of the building regulations team. I can't recall for sure, but I don't think I did, and I think I probably didn't.
Yeah. Did you know that the department had moved away from there being a regular cycle of review of the approved documents, the practical guidance that was being given? So there had been a regular cycle of review and it had to take place, but they'd moved away from that. Were you ever told about that?
No, I wasn't, not until after the fire.
So does it follow that you didn't know that the last major review of approved document B on fire safety had been in 2006?
I wasn't aware of that before the fire, no.
Were you ever told in general terms that the technical guidance for Part B of the building regulations on fire safety was known to be out of date?
No, I wasn't aware of that.
Did you understand that the enforcement of the building regulations was devolved to local authorities and building control officers? Did you understand that much?
Yes, I did, and that was something that I was aware of, partly because I was aware of the wide range of functions that local government carried out, and in particular some of their enforcement roles on trading standards, building regulations, and so on. So that I had a little bit more of an understanding of.
Yeah. Did you know about the system for private building control services via the approved inspectors scheme?
Yes, I was aware of that. I'm not quite sure why that was brought to my attention, but it was something that was discussed. And generally, the narrative was that this was a very effective scheme and that enforcement at a local level was something that was widely admired by other countries.
Right, I see. Where did you learn that from? Do you know? It
was part of the general conversation, and I can't remember whether it was in a specific meeting or whether it was just something that was discussed when we were talking about those functions. I can't really remember, but I do have a general recollection of a prevailing narrative that the system was very effective,
right.
But not any evidence that was supporting that. It was just what people said.
Yes, I understand. Were you ever made aware of any systematic problems or failings within the construction industry before the Grenfell Tower fire?
No, I wasn't.
Or any systematic problems or failings within the system of building regulation and building control? Did anyone talk about any systemic problems, any known failings, known issues with that?
No, I mean, I think the reason why I recall approved inspectors is that the conversation on reducing red tape almost certainly brought that topic in. And so I was aware that there was a debate about whether approved inspectors were a good thing or not, or whether it was allowing too much latitude in the industry, too much flexibility. So I was aware that there was that debate, but that it was seen as a deregulatory initiative, something that opened up competition, increased capacity, reduced reliance on local government resources, and so on. So I was aware of that general argument, but not at any kind of level of detail, and not any specific concerns about it.
Yeah.
And just help me with this. were you given the impression that approved inspectors operating on the private side, as opposed to the local authority, were effective regulators?
I don't think anyone ever used the word regulator in this context at all, and so no, I don't think that was the way it was seen. I think it was seen as an administrative task of approval, and I mean everybody had examples of, how difficult it had been to get building control to sign off on, changes to their own homes. So it was, again, the prevailing narrative was something around this being quite bureaucratic and it being good that there were choices available. And that had been a very strong set of political arguments in the previous few years. But I don't think it was seen as a regulatory function in the way that I would understand it today.
So it was widely admired, as you understood it, as a means of streamlining the process, but it's not clear that anyone actually thought, does this system operate as an effective regulator to prevent non-compliant materials or constructions from getting through the net?
I think that's right. I think that the concerns that people had about it would have been that maybe it allowed corners to be cut, but it was seen, as you say, as a system of streamlining and reducing burdens and speeding things up.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, thank you. Were you ever made aware at any stage prior to the fire that the drive for energy efficiency was promoting the use of combustible materials, for example, in the external walls of buildings?
No, I wasn't before the fire.
Yeah. Were you ever given any reassurance about the effectiveness of the building regulations prior to the Grenfell fire? Do you remember receiving positive news about it and its system?
Not beyond the things I've just discussed about the system more generally, as opposed to the regulations or the approved documents. So it was more the system that was talked about and the system of enforcement and approvals rather than the rules themselves.
Yes. Were you ever told that deaths from fire were falling statistically and that there was nothing to worry about in terms of fire safety? Do you remember that ever being said?
I was certainly told that deaths from fire were falling, as indeed is the case.
Yes.
Or was the case at the time. I wasn't told that there was nothing to worry about. The team that told me about overall deaths from fire safety was actually the fire team before it went across to the Home Office.
Yes.
I gave evidence to a Public Accounts Committee hearing in December 2015
Yes.
on the fire service.
Yes.
And as part of that briefing, I was informed about trends in, fires in the home and so on. And it is interesting to me now that there wasn't, as far as I recall, and I don't believe there was anything in my briefing either, anything about the building regulations and their contribution to that and to the safety system as a whole.
Yes.
It was a discussion that was entirely around the fire side.
Yes. Did you understand those trends to bear any relation to the efficacy in relation to severity of individual incidents?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
What was the relationship, you thought, between statistical deaths from fire and the efficacy of the building regulations? Was that link ever made?
No, I don't believe it was. I was told, and I think the department believed, that the reductions in the number of fires were due to things like smoke alarms in the home. And I can't recall if there was anything to do with the building regulations that was mentioned in that context, but I don't think there was. It was a different part of the department that was briefing me for that fire PAC hearing.
Yeah.
I also did a number of visits to fire services during that autumn to get to know the system. I went to two local authority areas and talked to their fire services to get an understanding of what they did.
Yeah.
And it was like a different bit of the department.
Yeah. Do you ever remember any discussions about the standards of fire safety in high-rise residential buildings, including in older housing stock high-rise buildings?
No, I'm afraid I don't.
Now, in terms of deregulation, I want to ask you some questions now about deregulation and your understanding of the effects that had on the department. And we know that one in, one out was an administrative policy that was introduced in 2011 and operated within government, whereby, in theory, no new regulation would be introduced without a compensating reduction in regulation being made. Is that correct?
Yes.
And did you have any direct experience in government of one in, one out, and later one in, two out, which we think was introduced in 2013, before your time at MHCLG?
So I had one specific prior experience, which was at HMRC, where we weren't covered by one in, one out, as I think it was at the time specifically, but we were required to commit to a programme of reductions in overall red tape, and that was mainly achieved by reducing the number of inspections, but it was also achieved by simplifying guidance and so on. So I remember that. I remember it being very challenging, because simplifying tax guidance usually means that you don't get as much money in, so the Treasury were quite worried about some of that. But I remember that debate happening in the years 2006 to 2011, so it was actually the back end of the Labour government before the coalition government. And that conversation had been going on generally about red tape for several decades. It wasn't new in 2010 with the coalition. Yeah. And then I remember I remember it being part of what we were doing in our relationships with Europe. So I was Europe Director at the Treasury, as you mentioned earlier, between 2002 and 2006. So reducing red tape was always a big thing that the UK was trying to get out of the EU, and I think the UK actually was responsible for mobilising quite a lot of the work that EU did itself on that. And I think it's important to remember there was scope for reducing red tape. There was quite a lot of needless bureaucracy and excessive detail. So it wasn't that these issues were wrong, and particularly in the early days, I think there was a lot that could be improved. I then finally remember when I was in the Cabinet Office, before I went to MHCLG, the Red Tape Challenge was coordinated by the Cabinet Office. I wasn't responsible for it myself, but I worked very closely with the implementation unit, who were responsible for overseeing the cross-Whitehall effort, and Oliver Letwin, as Minister in the Cabinet Office, was very involved in that, so I was aware of it. It was a very important part of the drumbeat of the coalition government, and then later the Conservative-led government after 2015. Yes.
And we know during your time at the department that one in, one out, then one in, two out became one in, three out in 2016. Is that correct?
Yes.
Yes. And the Red Tape Challenge, you've mentioned that several times. To what extent was that still impacting on the department when you were Permanent Secretary?
So I knew in the summer and autumn of 2015 that we were going to have to come up with some proposals to reduce our overall regulatory burden, as it would have been referred to at the time. And I don't recall anything other than the one meeting I mentioned earlier where I was taken through the beginning of those plans, I think in the first half of 2016 before the referendum. And to be honest, I recall at the time thinking that we almost certainly wouldn't be able to achieve one in, three out, because it was an extremely onerous request. And given what had already gone on in the preceding years, a lot of the low-hanging fruit had already been taken. So I was, although we never really explicitly pulled this out at the time because we didn't need to, in the end, I was expecting that we were going to need to have to, push back quite hard on those proposals. I didn't think that they would be achievable by the department.
Right. And did you in fact push back quite hard? Did you in fact have to do that?
It didn't actually get to that stage because during that summer and autumn, the main focus in the first instance was the spending review and agreeing our budgets for the next few years, and just mobilising the really big priorities coming out of the manifesto on housing and so on, and the way I was describing earlier. And the Red Tape Challenge didn't really catch up with us during that first autumn, as I recall. I think what was going on was that in the department, the analysts who were in charge of it, because it was a question of being able to measure costs and benefits, the analysts were doing the work. They did a very effective job, in fact, the analytical teams on this, I think, and they would have been going out and talking to the relevant owners of these systems and assessing and pulling together proposals and options and costs and benefits and risks and so on. And but that hadn't really crystallised but by the referendum, and it never really was ever as sharp again, as I recall.
Yes, thank you.
Certainly not after Grenfell Tower.
Yes. Now, Mr. Harrell, Richard Harrell, who was the head of technical policy in the Building Regulations Division between 2014 and 2017, he explained that the coalition government adopted a far more rigorous approach to deregulation with increased scrutiny of regulatory proposals. Was that your experience as well?
Yes.
Now, we've seen documents from 2012 describing MHCLG as a deregulating department. I think Mr. Leadsom, in fairness to him, explained that he was trying to show willingness and say, we understand we have to be deregulating as well when he wrote that. But would you agree with that description in your time there, that MHCLG was a deregulating department?
Not in my time in the department, no. Because, as I was describing earlier, we didn't really get to the point, I don't think, of drawing up major deregulations for the 2015 Parliament. I mean, it's possible that more work was going on in teams than I was aware of at the time, as I'm sure there was some preparatory work being done. But in the time that I was there, it just wasn't, in the end, a big part of our work, although it was still, certainly in the very first year or two, a big priority for the government, so we were having to get ready with proposals.
Right.
And I don't, from where I sat in the Cabinet Office between 2011 and 2015, I don't particularly recall DCLG, as then was, being highlighted as a major deregulator, but that's partly because there were other departments that had an awful lot more regulations and rules, such as DEFRA on the environment and so on, and the business department, which would have been the main focus.
Yes, I see. Were you aware during your time as Permanent Secretary of the pressures that civil servants felt at Mr. Harrell and Mr. Leadsom's level and below that to deliver on these deregulating policies? Were you aware how much pressure they felt to do that?
I didn't, as I was saying earlier, I don't think I spoke to the teams myself, and I was really, really saddened to see quite how much pressure Richard Harrell and others were under, and from the evidence they gave to the inquiry in the last few weeks. But I was certainly aware that this was very difficult for teams that owned rules like this, and that the demands that were being placed on them, particularly as time went on, and the easier things had already been found and delivered, that it was putting them under a lot of pressure. But I didn't talk to the team specifically, so I wasn't aware of the specific pressures on those individuals. Yes.
Can you give any explanation as to how they can have felt under so much pressure? And we'll come to some more detail about that. That really deregulation was driving an awful lot of the decisions they were taking, including after the Lakanal fire. Can you explain how they can have felt under that pressure, and yet you at the time weren't aware that they felt under those pressures?
I think we may be describing slightly different time periods here. So I arrived in 2015,
yes.
and the legacy of that previous few years, which was immediately after Lakanal House, I wasn't aware of because I wasn't in the department, but I was aware of it in a general sense across Whitehall. I saw the pressures everywhere, but I also saw the very strong drive from the government. It was in their manifesto. The civil service needed to engage with that and work with it. When it came to 2015 and when I arrived in the department, as I say, the slightly curious thing for me is that perhaps it's just a question of timing, but I was aware that the department was going to have these really tough targets to meet, and that they probably couldn't be met, and that I was going to need to be part of pushing back quite hard on that. And I was ready, I would have been ready for my meeting with the business secretary, and I would have been ready to defend the department and explain at a level of detail what could and couldn't be done and the consequences of going too far. I'm a bit disappointed, to be honest, that worry in the team wasn't somehow shared and dealt with at a more senior level by directors and the Director General Peter Schofield, because that's where I would have expected some of these issues to have been discussed and resolved. Because it's not the job of the civil service to just walk blindly into these issues. It is the job of the civil service to, engage with what ministers want, deliver when they've made a decision, but to pull out risks and consequences. So I'm surprised and, as I say, disappointed that they didn't feel they had that outlet and that they felt somewhat alone in it.
Can I just ask, do you think that a decision whether to add another regulation or whether to remove a regulation or whatever perhaps should have been taken by more senior people than the relatively junior civil servants from whom we heard?
Well, I think there would have been decisions for ministers, and our overall regulatory package, had we got to that stage, would have been something that would probably have been signed off by the Secretary of State. So I think it would have been escalated, and had we actually gone through the 1 in 3 out and had to deliver on it, I think it would have become a big thing during 2016, involving the Permanent Secretary, involving the Secretary of State, involving all the teams. And I would hope that we would have flushed out the problems and been able to get some of the concerns of the team on the table.
But I was thinking really that the pressure that appears to have been felt by some of the grade 7s, I think, possibly some of the grade 6s as well, might have been alleviated if they'd been told, look, you just push it up the line and let your deputy director, or maybe your director, whoever it's going to be, he can worry about this. You don't have to.
Yes, well, I think that is partly the role of the deputy director and the director, is to have an open door, to be listening, to be asking what people are worried about. And I guess by the time we got to 2015, this pressure on the team had been going on for quite a long time, and they may have felt that they just had to get on with it. And there were quite a lot of directors that moved around during that period, and they may not have felt they had the relationships to be able to raise those problems.
Yeah.
All right, thank you.
I mean, to give you a concrete example, we know now that in 2015, mid-2015, so after your appointment, officials within the Building Regulation Division decided to subsume a review of Approved Document B within a wider review of building regulation policy, because they felt they needed to be able to present any changes as part of a package of deregulation. That was the only way they felt that they could move forward. But that thereby caused years of delay to the process of reviewing Approved Document B. Yeah. Now, first of all, did you have any awareness that that was going on?
I didn't have any awareness of going on. My understanding from reading the documents is that that was discussed by Peter Schofield and Sally Randall as Director General and Director, and that it was something that was agreed, not just by the team themselves, that it was something that they discussed with their Director and DG, how to handle and how to pull it together. And, in my opinion, it wasn't necessarily the wrong thing to roll all this up into one programme that showed ministers that we were trying to achieve their objectives, but also provided for the necessary work following Lecknell House to be progressed as well. So it wasn't necessarily a problem, but I think as far as I can understand, what then happened was that the necessary work got lost as part of that roll-up.
Yes.
But I don't think it had to have done. I don't think the roll-up and the decision to have one package was a bad idea. In fact, I think it might have been quite a good idea. It makes it more coherent, easier to track, have a bigger, more visible portfolio of work. But I wasn't aware of it at the time, so I'm probably commenting more than I should really on things that I didn't have knowledge of.
I understand. But the difficulty with that is the reasons for doing it were not for those reasons, as far as we can see, but because they felt selling it as a deregulatory package was the only way they were going to get it through with ministers. So whilst there might have been other ancillary benefits, the main reason appeared to be the pressure they felt due to this objective of deregulation. Do you see?
Yes, I do. And I think, look, the deregulatory imperative did cast quite a shadow over teams like this, in this department and many others. And by the time we got to 2015, I think it had become, almost quite an extreme set of policy demands, actually. What I don't know is whether Peter Schofield and Sally Randall, who I think were engaged in this from what I can see from the papers I've read during that summer of 2015, whether they saw it quite in the way that the team did. I think they may have seen what I think later became the productivity review as in the way that I just described, that it was helpful to pull it all together, have it in one visible place.
Yes.
And that it wasn't because it could only be done because if it was a deregulatory package, but that it was helpful to at least explain how it contributed to deregulation. And if you didn't do that, then yes, you weren't going to be able to get what you needed progressed.
Yes, I understand. Did you get the general sense that regulation was bad, and even if there were regulatory proposals which might, on the face of it, look attractive to ministers, once it was recognised it was a regulation, they would pull back because it was not what they wanted to do to drive change? Now, that's a description we've had from Mr. Harrell. Do you agree with that description of the climate within DCLG at the time?
I don't think amongst officials at a senior level, as well as in the team, that it was as simple as that. It may well be how the team felt, but I think certainly someone like, for example, Sally Randall, who had overseen all the work on housing standards in the private rented sector, had an extremely strong knowledge and appreciation of the importance of the rules and the regulations and of how housing associations were governed and so on. So my impression was that the department actually was very expert, not just in the teams, but actually at a more senior level as well,
yes,
and had quite a broad understanding and, was ready to be able to explain to ministers where the trade-offs would lie.
Right. Were you aware that officials felt that they were working in a policy environment where regulatory intervention was a last resort?
I can't really comment on what they thought. I mean, I absolutely hear that that's what they thought. I don't think that other officials at a more senior level thought that regulation was a last resort. However, in the climate at the time, you would have had to have had a very good reason for new regulations or for putting in place the kind of system of regulatory oversight that has been put in since 2017,
yes,
or is being put in now through the Hackett Review and the new Act.
Yeah.
That would not have been something that was very well received, I think, in 2015, 2016.
No. And do you think anything short of the Grenfell Tower fire would have prompted that kind of action?
Well, I mean, I find it just horrific to think that we had to experience such a terrible loss of life and such an appalling catastrophe for the community and the families in order to understand quite what was going on. But my honest answer to the question is that I think that even if those issues had been the issues that the team were beginning to be aware of around cladding, even if somebody had come in and said, we're not exerting oversight, we need to do that. And I did do that on some other areas of the department's work, actually. Even if we'd done that, I think that by the time you got to 2015, the non-compliance in the industry was so entrenched, and that combined with the very strong focus on red tape and all the history of that over the previous few years would have made it very, very, very difficult to get anything changed. So I find it horrific to think that it took the fire, but I honestly am not sure that it would have happened otherwise.
Right. Did you know that we had a history in the UK of perhaps only bringing about major reforms in terms of fire safety in response to a multi-fatality incident? Were you aware of that prior to the Grenfell fire?
I was aware of other catastrophes such as Piper Alpha and the King's Cross fire and various other disasters, not just Bradford Stadium, and so on. The Herald of Free Enterprise. I was aware of those issues, and in fact, in 2017, after the fire, we put on a programme of events, and we got people who'd been involved in those to come in and talk to us about safety and what they'd learned and what hadn't been in place and what they'd put in place. We explored those issues very deeply. I don't think the civil service as a whole had an understanding of that history. I personally think that some of the failings in the department were not unique to the department. The department's culture was actually very committed. It was very collaborative, more so than most. And I think that looking back, and particularly from the perspective I have now of running a regulator, that an understanding of how to run regulatory oversight is not really very good in most Whitehall departments. It's not something that senior civil servants spend their careers on. It's not something that ministers particularly think about, and that history is not learnt from, explained, taught in a systematic way.
Yes. Now, back to the deregulatory agenda. Did you know in 2016 that the Better Regulation Unit within MHCLG effectively told officials within the Building Regulations Division not to propose any new regulation? Were you ever made aware of that?
No, I wasn't aware of that.
Were you aware that the Building Regulation Department of MHCLG, or the division, did not give any consideration to whether any of its work might legitimately be the subject of an exemption, for example, where life safety issues were potentially in play?
No, I wasn't aware of that.
Does it surprise you that no exemptions for the life safety parts of the building regulations was ever even considered by the Building Regulations Division?
I find that very surprising, and I believe that the fire safety order was given some form of exemption.
It was.
I find it very surprising, therefore, that the safety elements of the building regulations were not also given, at least thought to an exemption.
Yes, exactly. Some consideration of it.
Yes, I find that very surprising.
Yes, because so were you made aware at the time before the Grenfell fire that the Regulatory Reform Fire Safety Order 2005 had been specifically exempted from the government's red tape challenge in 2012?
I wasn't aware of that before the fire, no.
Yeah. Does it surprise you that officials within the Building Regulations Division also didn't take advice on whether, if clarification of the building regulations was all that was involved, those deregulatory policies were engaged? Does it surprise you they didn't take advice on whether a clarification effectively engaged those policies?
Yes, I would have thought that was one of the first questions, is does this work engage the red tape challenge? And if it didn't, then they wouldn't have had to worry about it.
Yes. Did you know at the time that, and Mr. Harrell's evidence is that approximately 70% of the building regulations relate to life safety? So, quite a significant chunk of building regulations are impacting on life safety.
I didn't know that at the time, no.
Were you
surprise
aware?
me, though.
Sorry.
It doesn't surprise me, but I wasn't aware of it at the time.
Yeah. Were you aware that officials were working on the basis that any change to the guidance they were giving about the building regulations needed to be the subject of a regulatory impact assessment because there would be a potential cost to industry of simply reading new guidance? Were you aware that that was the basis on which they were working?
No, and I'm very surprised by that. Because our analytical teams were in the lead on this, and I'm just very surprised that that dialogue wasn't there, and the analytical teams coordinated it precisely so that the department did have a knowledge of what the rules were and what was engaged and what wasn't. So I find that very surprising. I wasn't aware of it until you mentioned it to me just now.
Can you help us as to why those departments weren't talking constructively to one another so that it was clear what was engaging and what wasn't, and that if there was work that they needed to do for public safety reasons to clarify the guidance, they could work their way around these deregulatory policies? Can you explain that?
Not really, no. I find it very surprising. I would have expected it to be the first thing that Bob Leadsom and Stephen Aldridge, the director responsible for analysis, would have talked about. And if Bob had a concern that he wasn't being listened to, I would have expected Sally Randall to be a very sympathetic ear and one who was very well placed to be able to resolve any problems. I just find it quite difficult to know why they didn't have those conversations. But as I say, it's the first time I was aware of that.
Yes. Who are the analytical teams that you're referring to that you say there could have been conversations with?
So it's the Analytical Services Directorate. The director was Stephen Aldridge, and I don't know who the deputy directors were at the time. But my recollection is that the red tape team was in that directorate. I think that's the case, but I'm not 100% sure.
Yeah. Did you understand that it was fully envisaged that the government's deregulatory policies would be impacting on parts of the building regulations which were concerned with life safety?
No, I mean, I wasn't aware of that work in any level of detail, so no,
Yeah.
I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah. Did you ever have a concern that the government's wider priority in reducing regulation and red tape had increased competition amongst regulatory bodies, which led to a focus on cost cutting and cutting corners rather than an emphasis on competence and safety? Did you ever have those concerns, or those concerns drawn to your attention?
No, those concerns were never drawn to my attention at the time. I was not expecting that this was going to be easy, though, for the department, and I was gearing up for the fact that I was going to have to defend us. So I would have been quite sympathetic to those concerns, but we hadn't got to that stage by the time the referendum came along, and then the work was just no longer as pressured as it had been.
Yeah. How widely shared within your teams was that knowledge, that your awareness that you were likely to have to gear up for a bit of a fight over this? Was that shared with your executive team that you talked about? Was it shared with the deputy directors, the directors?
I'm sure we will have talked about it. I mean, because I'd been in the Cabinet Office, I did have a very good understanding of sort of cross-Whitehall activities where ministers were coming from, and it was one of the things I was bringing to the department. And what I recall is that I did have conversations with Peter Schofield, for whom this was the most relevant, about better regulation and whether it was going too far and whether it was going to be possible to achieve 1 in 3 out. I suspect that when we saw that in the manifesto, I'm pretty certain my own response will have been, I don't think that's going to be achievable. And I'm pretty sure I will have shared that view with my colleagues, yes.
Yeah.
And we may well have had I think we probably did have a bit of a debate about it. I don't recall having a conversation specifically with directors about it, but I don't think that view of mine would have gone unnoticed.
Yes. What checks and balances were in place, so far as you understood the position to be, to ensure that life safety was not unacceptably compromised by these deregulatory policies?
I just can't comment on that, I don't think. I wasn't aware of the work at any level of detail, so I can't really say.
Yeah, so you don't ever remember having conversations with your teams below you about what checks and balances there were to make sure you weren't going too far with deregulating in the fields which were impacting on public safety?
No, I don't remember having those conversations, and the context for that is the fact that I wasn't, as we were discussing earlier, really briefed up on the broader role of the building regulations and what they were seeking to achieve.
Yes. Were there any policies in place, so far as you were aware, to ensure that the department's obligations to safeguard life, including, for example, under Article 2 of the European Convention on Human Rights, were properly prioritised where they needed to be? Were you aware of any policies which gave guidance on that?
No, I wasn't.
Did you ever feel that you could push back to ministers on the deregulatory policies and targets? Did such conversations ever take place with ministers? And if so, can you give us some examples?
I would definitely have felt able to push back with ministers in my own department and elsewhere. And I would have been ready to talk to the Cabinet Secretary, Jeremy Hayward, if I felt that I had concerns as well. I did that on a number of occasions. I was doing it all the time, actually. But the conversation we're having is sort of making me feel that what's quite odd about 2015, 2016 was that red tape challenge just wasn't really very high up my agenda in 2015, because we were thinking about the spending review and our housing policies and so on. So it was clearly was a strong drumbeat still, and the teams were clearly gearing up and expecting that it was going to be a big problem for them. But because the decisions, I don't think, had crystallised for the department that early, I wasn't really aware of the trade-offs and the issues. And I think had we gone through 2016, I think a lot of this would have come out. We would have sat there, and I don't know whether the public safety issues would have been central to the conversation for the reasons I was describing earlier, that I don't think the department saw itself in that role of system oversight and with those responsibilities. But I think some of these tensions would definitely have been drawn out. But it just hadn't happened, as the timing issue is a little bit odd to me.
Yes. Do you think now, looking back, that there ought to have been guidance, policies in place to ensure that life safety wasn't being unacceptably compromised, and to give guidance to civil servants on when they should be escalating because they thought this was going too far, to give guidance on how much pressure they could tolerably deal with, but how much pushback there ought to be?
Yes, I think that should have been a responsibility of the work that was being led from the Cabinet Office, and I think it should have been happening inside the department as well. And it clearly happened to some extent because the fire safety order exemption was secured. And my understanding is that the then Secretary of State was quite instrumental in that and was certainly aware of it. So during that earlier Parliament, the conversations clearly were had in the department. The work reached a certain level of maturity, and then various actions and decisions were taken and some exemptions were secured. We hadn't got to that stage in 2015, 2016, but I think we would have done,
Right.
but there wasn't a system in place.
Yes.
And there weren't clear rules by the sound of it.
Yes, but can you see now how, if that was the atmosphere that they were operating in, albeit for legacy reasons, that even clarifying guidance may have felt to them just to be too difficult, too hard?
Yes, I can see that, and I think it's really very upsetting actually to think that they felt so beleaguered and alone. But we did have systems and processes in place in the department for them to escalate those concerns, and I am surprised that there wasn't more of a dialogue with those who were responsible for the overall red tape challenge in the department. And as I said, we did a full business planning exercise in the first 3 months of 2016, which was a chance for all these issues to be flushed out. The portfolio boards were a place in the autumn of that year and beyond for anything that was, not being progressed to the timescale or anything. That was the place where things could and should have been discussed. So we did have systems and processes in place in the department. And as I said earlier, it was a collaborative department. I worked in 5 in total in my time in the civil service, and this was overwhelmingly the most collaborative and friendly and supportive culture that I worked in.
Yes.
By a long distance.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, would that be a good moment for a break? I'm going to move on to a separate topic next.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, I think it probably would. Dame Melanie, we have a break during the morning and the afternoon, as you probably know, and this is a good time to take it. So we'll stop there. We'll come back at 25 to 12, please. And now you've started giving your evidence, I have to ask you not to discuss your evidence or anything relating to it with anyone once you're out of the room. All right?
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Would you like to go with the usher, please? Thank you very much, Ms. Grange. 25 to 12, please.
Thank you.
Would you ask Dame Melanie to come back in, please? Thank you. Good, Dame Melanie. Ready to carry on?
Yes, thank you.
Good. Thank you very much. Yes, Miss Gray.
Yes, thank you. Yes, I'm going to turn to a different topic now, which is what was discovered and what steps were taken in the immediate aftermath of the Grenfell Tower fire. And if we can look at your third witness statement, please. That's CLG 30030839, and look at page 3, paragraph 6. You tell us there, you say, on the morning of 14th of June 2017, the horrific scenes from Grenfell Tower immediately raised questions about the structure of the building and whether it was compliant with the building regulations. I recall that there were also questions in the media straight away about the department's response to the coroner's recommendations following the Lakanal House fire, including progress in revising approved document B. I recall that I attended a briefing with the Secretary of State on these questions at 8:30. Now, when you say there that questions were immediately raised about the structure of the building, whether it was compliant with the building regulations, are you referring to questions being raised in the media at that point, or questions being raised internally within the department?
Both. I can't recall exactly which questions were being raised in the media when, but what I do recall is that the question of the Lakanal House recommendations was part of the media story almost immediately.
Yeah.
And inside the department, that was also brought in very early in that 8:30 meeting, which I recall being quite an impromptu meeting. I think there was a more formally arranged one at 9:30, but
right.
I only attended the first 5 or 10 minutes of that.
Yes.
Anyway.
Yes. Now, who was present at that briefing with the Secretary of State at 8:30? Were any members of the Building Regulations Division present?
So I've explored this quite a bit because most people's recollection from their witness statements was that the meeting was at 9:30, but what I recall is that there were 2 meetings. And I think what happened was that I live quite close to the department and I came straight in and was in, I suspect, at about 8:15, as was the Secretary of State. And I think what happened was that anyone who was around came along to talk to him. And I think, but I can't be sure, that included Sally Randall and I think Steve Quartermain as well.
Right.
And there might have been members of the building regulations team, but I just don't remember.
Yeah.
But there was a much more formal and bigger meeting at 9:30, although that was more focused on the response and what was going on in North Kensington.
Yeah. And were these meetings minuted? Do you know? Were there any notes taken?
The 9:30 meeting was, yes.
Right.
The 8:30 meeting, I don't think so, because I think we would have found that minute and that would have helped me be sure that meeting happened.
Yeah.
So what I'm giving you is my recollection, but there's
Yes.
no documentary evidence that supports the 8:30 meeting. It's just what I'm pretty sure happened.
Yes. And was the Lakanal House fire and the coroner's recommendations, were they discussed at these early meetings?
Yes, I definitely knew about this by the time that meeting finished.
Yeah.
And I think Sally Randall raised it. Steve Quartermain was there as well. And I don't remember very much about it, but the fact of the documents not yet having been revised
Right.
and that deadline having been missed was in the room straight away, first thing on that Wednesday morning.
So that's what you can recall.
That's
from
what
that
I
meeting.
recall.
Yeah. And if we look at paragraph 8 now, I'll come back to paragraph 7 later. You say this, you say, I did not myself launch any investigations into the department's response to the coroner's recommendations following the Lakanal House inquest. But on the morning of the 14th of June, Helen McNamara, who was Director General for Housing and as such was the member of the executive team with oversight of the department's work on the building regulations, immediately asked for the relevant information to be pulled together. This was necessary to ensure that ministers had the facts and could respond to questions accurately. It included advice to ministers in 2013, subsequent correspondence and policy developments, and progress in delivering the agreed actions. Now, just pausing there, you tell us that Helen McNamara had oversight of the department's work on the building regulations, yes?
Yes.
What exactly do you mean by that when you say she had oversight of it?
What I mean is that that work was the responsibility of one of the teams and one of the directors in Helen's overall part of the department. And as such, I would have expected the work on the building regulations to be part of the portfolio board. structure and process that I was describing earlier.
Right. Did you ever discover whether, in fact, she had oversight in practice of the building regulations team and the work they were doing? Did you ever discuss that with her?
So I discussed with her after the fire that she, like me, had not heard of Lakanal House or the coroner's recommendations before, and we were both surprised that neither of us had heard of it before, and I trusted Helen when she said that.
Yes.
She'd arrived in the department in September 2016 when Peter Schofield left. He went in July, so there was a little bit of a gap, and then Helen arrived in September, and she was very active in using her portfolio board. Hers was the first that really got up and running properly, and she really supported making sure that all the programme oversight was there so that they had all the data and that they logged their actions and follow up and were looking at risks and were escalating. So she was very much on that process and used it because she felt she needed it because there was so much work going on. But she wasn't aware of those recommendations, but I would have expected her to know broadly what was going on the building regulations more generally.
Yes. But can we take it from that her portfolio board did not get any information about the Lakanal House fire, the coroner's recommendations? Because as we'll see, she wasn't aware of that either.
I can't say for sure what was or wasn't in the portfolio board, but and I didn't see the submissions on this myself during these years either, but my understanding from what I've seen since is that Lakanal House is not often mentioned in those submissions, and when it is mentioned it's usually in an annex. It's not being brought to bear as part of what ministers need to know when they're making decisions, as I would have expected it to be.
Yeah.
So it's possible that the work, in fact I think it's likely that the work and the pulled together broad portfolio of building regulations work that we were discussing earlier was one of the items in the portfolio of work that Helen was overseeing through her board, but it's quite probable that Lakanal House was not mentioned in any of those discussions, otherwise I think she would have picked it up.
Yes. Let's have a look at what she says in her own statement. This is at CLG 3031101, and I want to look at page 2. Here, she says at paragraph 5, she says, as indicated in my first witness statement, as Director General for Housing and Planning and MHCLG, I had 5 teams, each led by a director reporting to me. I established a governance and reporting system to manage the work of the teams. Each director led their area of work, and issues were escalated through the reporting system, and/or I had regular meetings with my director team, both together and individually. And she said, I also regularly met the senior civil servants working in housing and planning as a group and had meetings with the individual teams to talk about their work. And then if we can move down to paragraph 6, she says this. She says, one of the directors that reported to me was Steve Quartermain, who was the chief planner. Steve Quartermain was also the manager of the Building Regulations and Energy Performance Team, the BREP. As a result of the conversations that I had with Steve Quartermain and his team, I had a general understanding that they were undertaking work to simplify and improve the building regulations. Until the fire at Grenfell Tower on the 14th of June 2017, I was not aware of the relationship with the previous fire at Lakanal House, or of the coroner's recommendations, or of the former Secretary of State's response to those recommendations, and I was not aware of the focus on or issues with approved document B, or any particular urgency in the BREP's team's work to simplify and improve the building regulations beyond a general impetus to improve and simplify regulation. Nor, due to the supervisory nature of my role, was I involved in the detail of this work or the day-to-day operation of this team. Do you see that?
Yes.
Now, I think you've answered this already, but I'm going to, just to be absolutely clear, given Miss McNamara's role as Director General for Housing and Planning, would you have expected her to have known about the coroner's recommendations and the Secretary of State's response to those recommendations?
I would have expected somebody to have told her about that, yes, just as I would have expected somebody to have told me about it.
And is it fair to say that the fact that Miss McNamara was unaware of these matters is an indication of the lack of importance given in the department to those matters?
No, I don't think it's about the lack of importance given to those matters. I think that it's because somehow the importance of a coroner's recommendation was not appreciated, and somehow the department didn't have a system to flag those recommendations, didn't put any weight on them, and the team somehow lost sight of how important that was as a reason for the work that they were doing. I mean, ironically, I think if they had flagged that link every time, it would have had a big impact on the importance with which their work was seen. So I don't think it reflects a lack of importance. I think it reflects a lack of appreciation of the importance of coroner's recommendations.
Yes, I think I see. Now, you go on to tell us, if we go back to paragraph 10 on page 4 of your third statement, so CLG 3030839, you say this, you say, it was immediately clear that the department had not met the promised timescale for publishing a revised version of Approved Document B of the building regulations by 2016-17, although much of the preparatory work had been completed. The deadline of 2016-17 was not precise, but in line with the usual government conventions, I've always understood this to be a reference to the financial year, i.e. a deadline of the 31st of March 2017. Do you see that?
Yes.
Now, to your knowledge, was this or should that deadline have been obvious to anyone else within MHCLG, i.e. that it ought to have been a reference to the financial year, spring, March 2017, not later in 2017?
I would have expected that to be a strong default assumption, always, that when you say 2016-17, you mean by the very end of March 2017.
Right.
So it's entirely possible that might have been clarified at some point and changed to June or September. But if that was the case, I'd have expected it to be explicit, and yes. I don't think it was.
No, it appears that those working on this, well, certainly Mr. Harrell thought it meant they had to deliver by the autumn of 2017 in order to then ensure it was done by the end of 2017. But that's not your reading of it, based on civil service convention.
No, as I said, it's entirely possible that they might have reprogrammed it to allow for a deadline like that and agreed it with ministers. But I think they would have had to have gone through a process to agree that. I don't think they could have assumed that they had till the autumn when the date was set out in Eric Pickle's reply to the coroner back in 2013.
Yes, thank you. Now, I'm going to come back to some of what you say in paragraph 10 in a moment, but just looking for the moment at paragraph 11, below that, you say that your recollection is you became aware of this delay in meeting these recommendations at the 8:30 meeting with the Secretary of State. Now, was anything said about the delay to the publication of ADB at that meeting, and by who? Can you recall?
I think that Sally Randall mentioned it. I can't remember the conversation very well, but this was a meeting where we were all just coming to grips with what had happened, and I suspect that I and the Secretary of State were both asking questions about, what's happened on the building, was there something wrong with the building, what are our rules on buildings like that, and as well as what was going on with the fire locally. But although I think most of that came in the later meeting. So I think those general exploratory questions were what we were discussing.
Yeah. And
so in that context, I recall that Sally Randall mentioned it towards the end of the meeting, I think. And by the way, that we should have done this work.
Yeah.
And
do you remember her giving any reasons at that stage as to why that work hadn't been done?
No, I don't remember her or Steve Quartermain ducking that issue at all, though. I mean, it was in the room straight away, which is why I was so clear that I knew the department had just not met its deadline.
Yeah, yeah. Now, you go on to say in paragraph 11, picking it up in the second line, you say, I was certainly aware of it by the time I left the department for an external meeting at around 12:30, since it was discussed in my conversation with Sue Gray. Now, pausing there, Sue Gray's role at the time was?
She was head of propriety and ethics at the Cabinet Office.
Yeah. And you also go on to say that you texted Gavin Barwell about it at 12:44, and you give more detail about those exchanges in your statement. Let's just look at those text messages you sent to Gavin Barwell. If we can go to CLG 3030847, we can see that the text message states, Gavin, hope all is okay. Wanted to let you know that this terrible fire will highlight government delay in changing building regs. So you'll want to be briefed personally as ex-housing minister, as well as from number 10 perspective. Do you see that?
Yes.
So you were obviously concerned at this very early stage about the government delays in changing the building regulations when you texted Mr. Barwell, yes?
Yes, I was. And I felt that the department had let him down because Gavin had been a really outstanding housing minister and he'd been incredibly constructive, incredibly able. We'd delivered a huge amount during the time that he'd been our housing minister. And although I didn't at that stage know all of the details about what had happened or not happened when, I felt as his former permanent secretary that I owed it to him to let him know what had happened and, you know, that he was going to need to be briefed up on it because he was going to have to answer questions on it.
Yeah, yeah. At that very early stage, had you asked anyone why that delay had occurred?
I don't think so, not in any real detail. We had a discussion later on at about 3:30 when I came back from the department. So just to clarify my movements that morning, at about 9:40, I think I probably attended the beginnings of the 9:30 meeting that the Secretary of State had. And then I had to go to the Cabinet Office for the weekly meeting of permanent secretaries, which takes place at 10.
Yeah.
And we'd just had a general election. We didn't have a government yet. There was a lot to talk about. I had to go to that meeting. And I came back to the department at around 11:30, as usual, and then I had to go to this external meeting where I was representing the department that I just couldn't get out of. So I had a period at about between about 11:30 and 12, when I probably spoke to Helen McNamara. I think I did, and we will have talked about all sorts of issues, but I know that she was very much on top of trying to find out what had happened when.
Yeah.
And I don't know when I knew that and whether I knew it before I went out to that lunchtime engagement or after I came back, but I was certainly aware quite quickly that we were beginning to pull together the record to try to understand what had happened when.
Yeah. Help us with this. Why was it thought relevant at that early stage to the Grenfell Tower fire that the promised review of approved document B hadn't materialised?
Well, those who knew about Lakanal House, and that did include Sally Randall and a number of others, knew that it had been a very serious fire and that there had been issues around some of the panels, which were not exactly the same as, but related to some of the cladding issues at Grenfell Tower.
Yeah.
And they also knew that the department just hadn't met its commitment on an important and material set of recommendations. And so, I mean, the media will have driven us to have to answer those questions, but we were asking them ourselves as well.
Yes.
But whether there was a direct link between that recommendation and the causes of the fire was not at all clear. And I think, I don't recall this, but I don't think we thought that was so much the issue because we didn't know what had caused the fire at that stage. But I think we were just really concerned that the department hadn't done what it should have done.
Yes, yes. Now, just to complete these text messages, the message continues if we go to another document, CLG 3030848. And you get a little bit more text in this message or this version. So in the last 4 lines there, we can see you say, "We are still bottoming out and we'll let you know more later." Did you have further discussions with Gavin Barwell about this?
No, not for several weeks. And he didn't reply to my message.
Right.
But I could see, I believe, that he'd seen it.
Right.
I don't think I did actually. I think it wasn't a WhatsApp message, it was just a text message.
Yeah. And when you did...
I knew he'd received it. I don't quite know how, but
Right.
maybe Sue Gray told me that.
Yes. And when you did have some discussions with him several weeks later, do you remember the gist of what you discussed with him?
The reason I'm pausing is because we must have had a lot of conversations during that period, or at least several conversations. But my recollection, and it's only that, I've got no documentary evidence of any of this, is that sometime in probably early July, Gavin and I finally caught up with each other. He had obviously a massive amount on. He was Chief of Staff at number 10.
Yeah.
And I just really, as a courtesy as much as anything else, wanted to make sure that he knew that his former permanent secretary was aware of this and to check that he had the support he needed. That was really the gist of it. It wasn't a very long conversation that we had. It was on the phone, I think. And by that stage, things had moved on quite a bit. And we either had or had not. We were certainly on our way to announcing the Judith Hackett review, and the questions were clearly so much wider than just the approved documents. So in answer to your question, I don't think we had a particularly deep conversation about these issues. It was what I was trying to do was just to make sure he felt supported by the department.
Right, yeah. Now, if we go back to your third witness statement, page 15, paragraph 40, you say this here, you say, my best recollection is that Sue, so that's Sue Gray, we know, suggested that the snap general election and subsequent purdah period, which had unexpectedly prevented any government publications for several months, was the cause of the delay to the publication of the revised approved document B. And I told her this was a side issue as the election had been announced in mid-April. In other words, the department had missed the deadline even before the election was announced. Yes?
Yes.
Now, at this point, did you have any briefings? Were you given any information about the reason or reasons for the department's failure or inability to meet its own deadline for that revised version of approved document B?
No, I hadn't been given any reasons, and I hadn't at that stage seen any of the documentation.
Yeah.
But I think Sue was trying to be nice. She was trying to be helpful to me and the department and say, actually, is that the only reason it was delayed? And I was very clear that it wasn't the only reason it was delayed. That it was we hadn't even launched the final consultation on the document, so it wasn't going to be in place, even had it been consulted on slightly sooner.
Now, I want to look back now at what you said at paragraph 7, page 3 of this statement, the third statement. We skipped over it before, but I want to read that now. So you say there that morning, i.e. the morning of the Grenfell Tower fire, was, to the best of my recollection, the first time I'd heard of the Lakanal House fire, the coroner's recommendations, or the commitment to simplify approved document B by 2016-17. My predecessor, Bob Kerslake, did not raise the Lakanal House fire or the coroner's recommendations with me during our handover discussions in February 2015. Neither do I recall the ongoing work on the approved documents being discussed during any subsequent consideration of the departmental priorities between March 2015, when I became Permanent Secretary, and the 14th of June 2017. I describe in the paragraphs below my reflections on this in the context of the wider issues of building safety, which came to light in the weeks that followed. Now, in relation to those handover discussions between you and Bob Kerslake in February 2015, you say that he didn't mention the Lakanal House fire or the coroner's recommendations. What form did that handover briefing from him take? Was there a specific meeting or programme of meetings with him?
So during the month of February 2015, I spent pretty much all my time in the department. I agreed that with the Cabinet Secretary because it was such a tight timescale for me to get briefed up on the department and lead it through the general election. And so during that month, while Bob was still there as Permanent Secretary, I did a mix of having my own meetings on specific topics and sitting alongside Bob, including in the weekly meetings with Eric Pickles, looking at the whole of the department's business, and then having some one-to-one discussions with Bob. Not very many, I think we had 2 or 3. And they weren't particularly structured. I was asking Bob what he thought mattered. What would he be worrying about over these next few years? What were the issues? Particularly I was trying to get a sense of the next Parliament rather than just the finishing off of the existing one, which is what he was really focused on.
Now, you tell us later in your statement that you did speak to some of your predecessors after the Grenfell Tower fire. Did you ask Bob Kerslake what he knew about Lakanal House and the coroner's recommendations when you spoke to him?
Yes, I did.
And what did he tell you?
He told me a little bit about the recommendations from the coroner and how they were responded to. He said he didn't get very heavily involved in that work, but he remembers it, he remembered it, and he remembered that most of the recommendations were discharged or had already been discharged by the time of the coroner's recommendations or very soon thereafter.
Right.
And we didn't really talk very much about the approved document work. But Bob is a very deep expert in housing and local government, and he gave me his reflections on the comparisons between the Grenfell Tower fire and Lakanal House, how there were clearly some similar issues, but he didn't raise any of the wider system oversight issues that I became so concerned about in the subsequent days.
Yeah.
There is actually a minute of my discussion with him that I discovered in reading around my papers a few days ago, which has been submitted to the inquiry, I believe.
Right, I see. Did you ask him why it hadn't been included in any briefing to you from him or his team? Did you ask that question?
No, I didn't. I don't think I did anyway.
Do you think that Mr Kerslake's failure to mention the Lakanal House fire, the coroner's recommendations and the work on the approved documents perhaps tell us something about the extent to which those matters were recognised as a priority in the department?
Yes, I think that the department in 2013 did not see the coroner's recommendations on the building regulations as particularly important for public safety, and I think the department interpreted the recommendations as not particularly well written and not particularly clear, and were probably a little bit dismissive of them, if I'm honest, when I look back at the correspondence. I read the coroner's recommendation myself again yesterday, and I thought, with hindsight, how clear she was about the issues, yes, and that somehow that wasn't heard by the department in 2013. And my impression, I wasn't there, of course, but my impression is that the team were left to form the response, and there wasn't particularly very much oversight of that. And I suspect the fire side of the department were dominant in coordinating and leading on the work, and that the building regulations were the junior partner.
Yes.
And that Bob's own view on this was conditioned by that environment in the department in the same way as mine was in 2015 and 2016.
Yes. So does it follow from that he'd been led to believe that there wasn't really much in these recommendations, there wasn't much to worry about, it didn't impact on public safety, either work had been done or it was fairly straightforward work? Is that the impression he was given?
I think it's a bit hard for me to say exactly what was in his mind and what he was told and wasn't told in 2013, but so I don't think there's very much more I can say, to be honest. I'm a little bit worried I might be adding more than I know.
Yes. Let's look at some correspondence before the Grenfell Tower fire in terms of what your office was being sent. Mm-hmm. Can we go to CLG 3019312? This is an email from Alex Murphy in the Building Regulations and Standards Division, dated the 10th of November 2015. We can see from the subject there that it's in relation to the simplification of building regulations and building control system, and it's got some attachments to it. And we can see that your office is copied in, it's CC'd in. Do you see that?
Yes.
It's been gisted here, but Office of Melanie Dawes appears in a box next to the names of Bob Ledson and Richard Harrell. And we can see that Alex Murphy says, "Hi Sarah, as discussed, please see attached submission on work to simplify the building regulations, approved documents and building control system." Thanks, Alex. And then if we look at the attachment, which appears at CLG 3019313, we can see that this is a submission to James Wharton and Greg Clark from Alex Murphy, dated the 10th of November 2015. We can see the heading again, simplification of building regulations and building control system, and then we read in the summary, in paragraph 1, this submission sets out proposals to simplify the building regulations and associated approved documents and to explore options to reform the building control system. This work will seek to deliver annual savings to business of 20 to 50 million. It will support housing implementation task force commitments on deregulation and establish a platform for further deregulation in the long term. So heavy emphasis on deregulation at the beginning of this submission, yes?
Yes.
And then if we look at page 5, in what's called Annex A, technical issues to be addressed, we can see under Part B, fire safety, it tells us the previous Secretary of State committed to undertaking review and simplification of Part B following the coroner's inquest into the Lakanal House fire, which was critical of the clarity and format of existing guidance, which it was suggested contributed to a number of deaths. Do you see that there?
Yes.
Now, do you recall ever seeing this email from Alex Murphy and the attached submission to ministers?
No, I don't believe I did see it.
And just help us, where we see an email where it's got Office of Melanie Dawes on the email, who will that go to in practice?
Yes. So, like all permanent secretaries, I had a private office which consisted of 4 people, one running the diary and the other 3 overseeing the work of the department and supporting me in my role. And we received around 1,000 emails a week that would have come into that inbox. So it was a lot. And what my office did was essentially triage what they thought I needed to see. And sometimes things were urgent and needed to be brought to my attention really quickly in the moment. Sometimes there were things for my action, a document I needed to formally approve or sign off, or something I needed to write myself, or letters I needed to reply to personally. But a lot of what was going on there was just the department going about its business, and what my office were doing was working out what needed to come to my attention. So the system we had was that at the end of every week on a Friday afternoon, I received 3 updates, one on housing and planning and local growth, and one on local government, and one on the corporate side. And each of those updates contained about 10 or 12 submissions, notes, documents, things that had been published that I might be interested in. So it was quite a lot even then, but it was still a subset of what the department was up to.
Yes.
And I would go through that on a Sunday morning. It would take about 4 or 6 hours, and it was reading essentially. My office would work out what should go in those updates in discussion with Directors General and directors. So sometimes there would be priorities I had.
Yes.
I got involved in some quite technical things, partly through interest, relatively few, because I didn't have very much time to devote to that kind of thing. But so sometimes it would be that, but more usually it would just be something they thought I should be aware of. And my understanding is that there's no documents referencing Lakanal House that were ever brought to my update, into my update. There was a reference to this one that was in the relevant update, but the submission itself was not attached. I was invited to have a look at it if I wanted to, but I don't think I did.
Yes, I'm going to take you to that email in just a moment,
apologies.
because it's very recently been disclosed to us.
Yes.
So I will take you to that. Just concentrating on this submission for a moment, given the mention of deaths at Lakanal House in this submission and the coroner's recommendation on approved document B linked to that, looking back, should this have been brought to your attention at the time by members of your office?
No, I don't think it should. There was no reference, as far as I'm aware, in the submission to Lakanal House or to a coroner's recommendation.
There's
and
not.
As such, they will have been, looking at the submission. They wouldn't have read all of the annexes in order to judge whether or not it should go into my inbox.
Yes.
And they would have been discussing it with directors and with Peter Schofield at the time, the Director General. Does Melanie need to see this?
Yes.
Do you think it's important?
Yes. Now, do you think, had this been higher up and in the body of the submission itself, flagged early, I think you said earlier, often when Lakanal was mentioned, and it was rarely mentioned, it was put in an annex, it wasn't in the body of the submission. I appreciate it's, it's looking back, speculating to some extent, but would you have expected your office to have flagged this to you had that paragraph been higher up in the submission?
They would have been more likely to, and I think that because they were very good and very conscientious and had an enormous workload, but they took very seriously the need to make sure that things I needed to see I saw, and they chased me up and followed up when I hadn't managed to do everything. So they were extremely conscientious. Perhaps not every submission needed to mention Lakanal House, but from what I've seen of the record, and I haven't read them all, but from what I've heard from the department about the searches we've done, it was barely mentioned in the body of the submission. And submissions are supposed to include things that are important for ministers' decision-making. I think the fact that this was a coroner's recommendation was important.
Yes.
And so had it been flagged more often and in a different way, I think it would have become part of the discourse and the discussion, and probably I would have at some point have been something that I was made aware of. Now, me being made aware of it wouldn't necessarily have changed things, of course. This is just about information to the Permanent Secretary, so I would still have been relying on my Directors General, and the portfolio system we put in place later to be chasing work and making sure that it went to time. And that was the main assurance I got, rather than my own update notes.
Yes.
But you when you're a Permanent Secretary, you rely on lots and lots of different things. And you have to have layers of assurance and knowledge and information, some formal, some informal. And this was one of several.
Yes. Yes, I understand. And can we agree this wasn't any old inquest, was it? Not that any inquest is insignificant, it's not. But this was where there'd been multiple fatalities, and you'd had a special person brought in as coroner, with someone with expertise in construction and buildings. Wasn't that something as well that ought to have raised this up the priority list?
Yes, I think it should have done. It was a really serious fire, and there haven't been as many deaths from fire in England or the UK over the last few decades. And the very fact that this fire happened and that there were fatalities on quite a significant scale, should have, I think, been more in the department's consciousness as the years went by.
Yes.
And the fire became slightly further away.
Yes. Thank you. Let's look at the little roundup email that you were talking about. It's at CLG 3036413. Coming up, CLG 3036413. Is there a problem? Okay. We've got that email. It was only disclosed to us yesterday. I know it's been disclosed, but it may just be delayed getting onto our system. What I'll do is I'll take you back to that. But what we see is a number of issues being brought to your attention, including the work to simplify Approved Document B. And it's from your office to you personally. So that was something that you would review on a weekend, yes?
Yes.
To check.
You may want to come on to this when we have the document in front of us, but my understanding is that was a follow-up to one of that week's updates. So it was an example of a relatively small segment of that week's work.
And Lakanal House and the coroner's recommendations aren't mentioned in the kind of sentences that you're given in that. I think they're actually lifted from paragraph 1 of the submission, which I just read to you.
Yes, that's my recollection too. Without here is the document.
Here. So here we have. It's an email dated the 11th of November 2015, so it's the day after the 10th of November submission that we were just looking at. And it's from the Office of Melanie Dawes to Melanie Dawes, yes?
Yes.
So that's coming to you for your personal attention. And we can see, third bullet point down, it says advice has gone to ministers setting out proposals to simplify the building regulations and associated approved documents and to explore options to reform the building control system. This work will seek to deliver annual savings to business. So it's exactly the same text that I read to you from the first paragraph of the submission. Someone looks like they've cut and pasted it. Does that sound right?
Yes.
So had Lakanal House and the coroner's recommendations been in paragraph 1 of the ministerial submission, it might well have found its way into this update to you.
Yes, it almost certainly would have done.
Yes. Thank you.
And this gives you an indication of the sorts of issues I was being updated on, often quite technical.
Yes.
So it's not that I was only focused on the ministerial priorities. I mean, this is a whole array of different things.
Yes.
And is quite a good example, actually, albeit, as I say, quite a short segment, because normally there would be about 3 times of this just on the housing and devolution side, but it gives you a flavour for how my office kept me updated.
Yes. In paragraph 7 of your third statement, you told us that you weren't aware that there was ongoing work on the approved documents and that wasn't brought to your attention. It does appear that that was brought to your attention, albeit only in this email as far as we can see. Is that fair?
Yes, I think what I meant in my witness statement was the work on the approved documents following Lakanal House in response to the coroner's recommendations.
Rather than
a broader work programme, yes. My apologies if that isn't quite clear, but that was what I meant.
No, I understand. Thank you. Now, if we can look at another kind of episode, this time in 2015, if we can go to CLG 1307729. This is an email chain from October and November 2015, and I want to start by looking. There's an email at the bottom of page 2 of this string.
Yes.
29th of October 2015, from Ronnie King to a number of individuals, including the Private Secretary of James Wharton. Do you see that? And the subject is APPG, Fire Safety and Rescue Group. And what appears to be going on here is that in his email, Mr. King is confirming the date of a meeting between Sir David Amess and the Minister James Wharton. Yes?
Yes.
And we can see towards the bottom of that email, if we go on to page 3, that we get an indication of what this meeting is going to be about. And it says in the second paragraph, there'll be no formal recorded minutes taken at the meeting, but I will assemble the topics for discussion in advance, which have been the subject of recent concern at all party group meetings and which will centre around the current review of approved document B to the building regulations, leading to a revised document being published in 2016-2017. And then in brackets it says, as set out in the Secretary of State's letter to Her Honour Francis Kirkham, CBE, Assistant Deputy Coroner, following the Lakanal House inquest, and in Hansard, and then there's reference to a Hansard debate. So that meeting's being set up. Just pausing there, had you heard of the APPG when you were Permanent Secretary of MHCLG?
No, there are many APPGs, and
right.
I didn't come across this one, or indeed really very many of the others either.
Right, so you hadn't come across the fire safety version of the APPG?
No.
If we go up to page 1 then, and we look at the penultimate email on page 1, what we see is that there's an email from your office, if we could just blow that up, on the 24th of November 2015, 1501. We can see it's from Office of Melanie Dawes, and it's to Brian Martin, who we know was the technical policy lead on fire safety, and Private Secretary of James Wharton, CCing Bob Leadsom, Sally Randall, Richard Harrell, and others. And what your office says is this, just to flag that Melanie will be at the PAC, is that Public Accounts Committee?
Yes.
She'll be at the Public Accounts Committee on Fire Sustainability from 10:30 a.m. So this could possibly come up. Those could still be going on when the meeting starts. Now, can you help us? What was the nature of the Public Accounts Committee on Fire Sustainability?
Yeah, so this in fact was the hearing that I mentioned earlier.
Yes.
And I think I said it was in December 2015, but I can see from here that it must have been November.
Yeah.
And I recall that it was the day after, or 1 or 2 days after the spending review. So it was a particularly crazy time, to be honest. But it just in the sense of the workload and what was going on in government and in the department. The PAC hearing was on the back of a National Audit Office report into the sustainability of fire services, and there were a number of those reports on different services that were overseen or related to local government. So they did reports on sustainability of social care and a number of other issues, and this was the fire one. And I had extensive briefing to prepare for that hearing. It was led by the fire side of the department, which was shortly to leave us and go to the Home Office. And that line that Brian Nash offers was very much the sort of overall narrative, to be honest. which is that fire incidents had halved, and that there was a lot of efficiencies that could still be driven out of fire and rescue authorities.
Yeah, so you're looking at the email above,
Yes.
in which you've got a line to take, which says, alongside the rest of local government, fire and rescue authorities will have to continue to play their part in reducing the deficit. Fire incidents have halved in the last decade, and the night review was clear that there's scope for fire assessors to make efficiencies.
I think that could be fire and rescue.
Fire and rescue authorities to make efficiencies, whilst continuing to deliver a good service to the public. So is that the gist of what you were getting across to the Public Accounts Committee?
That was the gist of the department's line.
Yeah.
I would not have delivered that line quite as
Right.
boldly as that.
No.
But I would have made some of the points about efficiencies, and I had a lot of information about the numbers. However, it was clear that funding had been reduced.
Yes.
And one of the things I sought to explore in preparing for that hearing was what the numbers were, what the impact had been, what the department's oversight was, whether it was good enough. And we did put in place quite a lot of work after that hearing to try to improve some of that oversight.
Yes, but was that very intensely focused on fire and rescue authorities?
It was.
Yeah.
And we, to the best of my knowledge and recollection, the building regulations weren't mentioned as part of the meetings I had to prepare for that. It was all on the far side.
Yes, that was my next question, yes. Can you help us as to what might have been meant in this email from your office? This could possibly come up. On one reading of this email chain, it seems to be suggesting that this meeting between David Amos and the APPG on fire safety might come up, or possibly Lackland House and the coroner's recommendations might come up. Can you help us with that?
So I hadn't seen this email before, and I suspect that this is Charlotte in my office who actually supported me on the local government side.
Yeah.
And that included the fire portfolio of work. This is Charlotte being very thoughtful about whether or not her permanent secretary might get asked a question about this APPG meeting.
Yeah.
Because it might be in MPs' minds, and she wanted to make sure that if there was such a question, I would be able to answer it.
Yeah.
I don't think there was a question about it, and I think they were really rather independent processes, actually, but she was just being very punctilious and trying to make sure I didn't get a question I wasn't ready for.
Yeah, and this doesn't provoke any recollection about whether anyone mentioned Lackland House or the coroner's recommendations to you at this point?
No, I'm pretty confident they didn't.
Yeah.
And the line to take that I've been given there doesn't make that link at all. It talks about the overall, approach to fire and rescue, which was fine for that hearing, actually, as it happened. Yeah. But didn't actually relate to the APPG discussion. Yeah. And just to be that's the first time I've seen these emails, so
no, understood.
Responding to them in the moment a bit.
Yes, just to be absolutely clear, did you attend the lunch between James Wharton and David Amos?
No.
No, you wouldn't have gone on and...
I wasn't invited, and I didn't attend, no.
Right. Just can I look at a few other documents? If we go to CLG 1308740... Here we have, on the 15th of November 2016 now, so a year on, there's a letter from Brandon Lewis, we can see Minister of State for Policing and the Fire Service, to Gavin Barwell MP of that date. And we can see from the first paragraph that he says, "Dear Gavin, I'm writing to you about the department's long-standing commitment to review approved document B, which provides advice on the measures that are needed to meet the functional requirements of the fire safety provisions of the building regulations. Although the guidance includes amendments from 2010 and 2013, it has not been formally reviewed since 2006, despite the commitment of the Right Honourable Eric Pickles in his 2013 response to the coroner, who led the inquest into the cause of fatalities in the 2009 Lackland House fire." Now, if there was correspondence like this between ministers, would you normally expect to see it? Or again, would it be a matter for your office to decide whether to draw it to your attention?
I wouldn't normally expect to see ministerial correspondence, no. And I don't believe this was drawn to my attention.
No. We can see, just to finish this, that at point 2 of this letter, towards the bottom, if we can scroll down the page, we can see that there's a paragraph beginning, my officials met recently with representatives from the Fire Sector Federation who highlighted that the following areas are causing concern within the fire sector. And number 2 is changes in construction technology, in particular increased use of combustible materials. Now, just for the avoidance of doubt, did you ever become aware of those concerns that were being raised? Changes in construction technology, in particular increased use of combustible materials?
No, I didn't become aware of those issues before the fire.
Now, can we go now to another document, CLG 30193990? We're now in 2017. This is an email we can see from the top. We could just blow it up so we can all see. From Richard Harrell on the 23rd of March 2017 to Gavin Barwell's office and the office of Sajid Javid. And we can see that your office is copied into this. Do you see that? CC'd Office of Melanie Dawes.
Yes.
And we can see that the purpose of this submission, and we get it from the first paragraph of this email, please see attached submission seeking Minister's agreement to the content of the building regulations discussion document and potential scope of future work on building regulations and the building control system. Do you see that?
Yes.
And then if we could go to the submission itself, this is at CLG 30193992. So here's the submission. We can see the purpose at the beginning. It said, Ministers previously approved development of a discussion document setting out the potential scope of work on the building regulations policy over coming years. This submission seeks Ministers' agreement on the proposed scope as set out in the final draft discussion document. And then there are recommendations below that, including to agree to meet with officials to review the content of the discussion document. And then if we go to the bottom of page 3, we can see that it states in paragraph 13, under key risks and issues, it says this: changes to building regulations, whether new regulation or deregulation, have significant consequences for society and business. A summary is provided at Annex B. Issues likely to be of most interest of which ministers should be aware include, and then the first bullet point is the 2013 coroner's report on the fire at Lakanal House fire, criticised the clarity of the guidance on Part B fire safety, and in response to this, the then Secretary of State, Eric Pickles, committed to review it. We have started work on a redraft as recommended by the coroner, but we will need to work with industry to take this further. There are regular calls on the government to set out when and how this work will be taken forward. We have constrained the proposed scope of the review of Part B to areas of highest priority, but the fire lobby is powerful and there will be pressure to do more. So we can see there that did actually appear in the body of the submission this time.
Yes, it did.
Now, can you remember ever reading that submission when it was copied into your office?
No, I don't remember reading it, and I don't think it was included in my weekly update at the time.
Should officials within your office have read this and drawn this to your attention at some point?
Well, in making the decision as to what to bring to my attention at that particular time, they will have been doing what they always did, which was talking to DGs and directors and, asking whether this was something that needed my personal, view or needed me to see it.
Yeah.
And so it's a little bit hard to say without knowing exactly what else I was looking at the time, but it will partly have been about that. We'd just had a budget. We'd just published the white paper on housing, which was a huge piece of work that had been done in a really short space of time. So there was a lot of other work going on. There were devolution deals concluding. And so I don't think I can say I think they should have included it. With hindsight, I wish they had, but that is with the benefit of hindsight. Yeah. I think it's not really the same question as to whether they should have done it at the time.
No. Can we agree that the gist of that paragraph ought to have been not on page 3, but actually in paragraph 1 of the submission?
Well, probably. I mean, if it had been more regularly present, then you wouldn't have needed to keep drumming it home every single time. But in an ideal world, yes, it would have been a bit higher up, and there's no mention of the timescale either in that bullet, and the fact that it was about to be missed, according to my interpretation of the dates anyway.
Yes. And we put that to Mr. Leadsom and Mr. Harrell, and in fairness to them, they accepted that should have been in there. But can we agree that you should have been made aware of all of these matters prior to the Grenfell Tower fire, in some form or another?
I do certainly think that we should have had some kind of system in place, or the right kind of, if you like, cultural approach really in place for that link to recommendations from a coroner following a fire as serious as Lakanal House. We should have had some system in place that meant those issues were escalated to me, to Helen McNamara, to the Secretary of State, and held in a more present way across the department. And I think every government department should learn from that, to be honest, because it wasn't in place in MHCLG, and it's, I think, something I wish I'd put in, actually, but I didn't think to ask at the time. Whether or not I should have then been copied in on specific submissions on the building regulations, I think it's just a little bit harder to judge. This was seen as a technical exercise and not therefore one that was relevant to public safety. So once you've got to that place, then it isn't necessarily clear that it was something that the Permanent Secretary needed to be kept abreast of or copied in on all the time.
Yes.
So I think that's a little bit harder to answer. With the benefit of hindsight, I certainly would have wished I'd seen this, although it was quite late in the day by this stage, of course.
Well, I'm going to come back later in your evidence to some of the warnings that the department was receiving from industry about the building regulations and about the approved documents, and perhaps we'll return to that topic about whether or not, in fact, you should have been made aware of more information about that process. Had you been made aware of the failure to meet the Lakanal commitment, the failure to meet the 2016-2017 deadline, what steps do you anticipate you would have taken to ensure that that was addressed without further delay?
If I'd known that there was a recommendation from a coroner, I would have asked about it. I would have asked to be briefed on it, and I probably would have had a short meeting on it to find out what it was and what the work was that needed to be done, and particularly what the timescales were. I would have been pretty hot on the deadlines.
Yeah.
And that might or might not have made any difference. I mean, the Permanent Secretary having a meeting on something is not nearly as important as the team and the directors and the Director General and ministers who are actually working on these things in the moment, actually having the right conversations and pushing these things forward. But I guess it probably would have sent a signal through the system at the very least that this mattered. I think others around me, had they been aware, would also have done some of what I just described. I think Helen McNamara would have done so. I think Lisanne Boissière, as our head of strategy, would have done so, although she was not head of strategy until a little bit after this period. She was head of housing strategy at this point, and she was putting together all the housing work and prioritising it and looking at an overview for Helen.
And just to be clear, if you'd been told at that point, well, look, part of the reason why we haven't progressed is because we're so overwhelmed, we don't have the resources, was there something that could have been done about that had it been escalated to either Helen McNamara or to you or one of the other people you've just mentioned?
Well, yes, I would have. Once I'd found out that it was delayed, I would have asked why, and I guess all those issues would have come out, including the links with the red tape challenge, and then I would have asked for those to be addressed. And to be honest, just by having a discussion, and had I had it, I would have had others in the room, like Helen, probably Steve Quartermain, maybe Stephen Aldridge. Normally, that would have been enough for people to go away from the meeting and go, oh, goodness me, we need to be on this. And we probably would have had an email note that would have recorded that, and I would have talked, I wouldn't probably have talked personally, but my HR teams would have perhaps swung in to help the team with what were clearly resourcing issues, which I think were related partly to budget cuts, but also just to being able to attract the right people to fill the roles.
Yes.
So that's a question of how we were recruiting and whether they were getting the assistance they needed to find people.
Yes. So all of those issues could have been explored.
They could have been, yes.
Just been escalated.
Yes. I do think, though, I don't want to leave you with the impression that these things only get explored when the Permanent Secretary takes an interest, because you just can't run a government department like that. There's too much going on. But I do think the Lakanal House flag would have given these issues a prominence if it had been used a bit more, which is something I think is just very regrettable, because I think it would have helped the team.
Yes.
And they would have found their job easier and wouldn't have been so worried.
Yes. Yes. I think they felt, or what we've been told is they felt that they didn't want to keep drawing attention to past delays and past failings, because in a way, what was the point of that? I mean, what's your response to that?
I can see that as time went on, it got harder and harder for them to escalate it, because you sort of hope that you can find your own way through. And my experience of leading organisations is that normally the first response of any team when things go wrong is to try to fix the problem. Yeah. And that's a natural and very positive human instinct. And one of the things you have to do in a department like this is encourage people to come forward and have a culture that allows that to be the case. Because, you know, sometimes when something serious has gone wrong, it's quite rare the team can solve it themselves. So what I'm thinking when I'm describing this to you is of some errors we made on local government finance during my time as Permanent Secretary, and the first time it took a couple of weeks for those to be flagged, and because the team tried to fix it and they couldn't, and by the time they realised that, it was much more serious. And so what we did there, we did a review of that system, in fact, and an external review. This is in 2018. And one of the things we did out of that was to really, really try and support the team in believing that if they did come forward, if there was a mistake again, and there was another mistake actually, that they would be listened to and they wouldn't be attacked and they wouldn't be blamed, but they would be heard and they would be helped to sort the problem out. So this is an incredibly important part of leadership for me in organisations like this, that you try to create those channels. And I feel, you know, a sense of surprise that this was so held by the team on their own, but also a sense of real regret that somehow the department, despite having, I think, quite a lot of systems in place, didn't manage to have the conversations with itself and across different teams that it needed to have and could have had.
Yeah, yeah.
My apologies for a rather long answer.
No, that's absolutely fine. Just going back to an answer you gave a minute ago, you said that the review of approved document B was seen as a technical exercise and not relevant to public safety. What's your understanding about how it came to be seen that way? Because it wasn't merely a technical exercise, it was absolutely relevant to public safety, wasn't it?
I think it was now, with the benefit of hindsight, yes. And as I said, I think you read the coroner's recommendations, you know, in a particular light now after the fire in a way that perhaps they weren't read at the time in 2013. I mean, it's difficult for me to say because I wasn't involved at the time. So what I will say is pure reflection on my part, having seen some of the documents and so on. I think that in 2013, the fire teams led the response to Lakanal House. The building safety team was, I think, the junior partner. I believe it's the case that Peter Schofield, the Director General for Housing, wasn't even copied in on the final submission that brought all those issues together in one place for the Secretary of State. I think that tells you that it was being dealt with by the other half of the department as it was at the time, because there were just two Director Generals on the policy side. And I think the team were left to their own work. It was highly technical. Brian Martin himself had given evidence to the inquiry. He was clearly on top of the technical issues. A lot of people outside said to me after the fire how well regarded the experts were in the building regulations team, and I think the department probably rightly in some ways had that view themselves. And so nobody thought that they could add any value to the judgments that the team were making about what mattered in response to the fire. Nobody saw the wider issues of system oversight that I think we now know were completely lacking in the department's appreciation of its role. And a certain sort of mentality of that must have combined a lot of worry amongst the team members, but also a certain perhaps complacency that they had it all under control, and that this wasn't material to the work that they were doing and the way that they saw the system.
Yes. When you say after the fire you spoke to people and you learnt that this building regulations team were highly regarded, who told you that?
I was told that by Ken Knight, Sir Ken Knight. I was also told that by Peter Bonfield from the Building Regulations establishment.
Yes. Did you think about whether individuals like that might be simply too close to these individuals to give you an objective assessment on their work?
Well, I didn't particularly act on what they had told me. I was reassured by it to some extent, but what I heard them say to me was that they knew the detail, they knew the technical issues, they were respected across the industry. And I mean, perhaps we'll come on to some of this, but in thinking about what had gone wrong and the worries I began to have quite quickly about the whole system and it being failing, I did wonder whether or not the teams were capable of doing the job, and I guess I did take some reassurance from what I heard that they were technically able and on top of the issue. So maybe I did act on it actually on reflection.
Okay. The ministerial submission we were looking at, this one, in March 2017, did have the discussion document attached to it. Do you remember anyone ever bringing that discussion document or the contents of it to your attention?
No.
Now, if we could go and look at now your third statement again, paragraph 18 on page 6. So CLG 30300839. You say, it's right at the bottom of that page, you say, over the following weeks, or the following few weeks, I inquired into these questions by reading the background documents, including some of the transcripts of the Lakanal House inquest and reports of previous fires over the past 20 years. I also spoke to people in the fire service and the industry and to several of my predecessors as permanent secretary. I do not have records of these conversations, but I recall being struck that my predecessors had not had any inkling, I think you mean of any of the problems that were now coming to the surface, and they did not recall building safety issues of this kind being escalated to them. Yes. Now, you say you read some of the transcripts. Did you read the transcripts of Mr. Martin's evidence to the Lakanal inquest?
Yes, I did.
We know he gave evidence for a full day on the 13th of March 2013. In general terms, did anything strike you about his evidence to the coroner when you read it?
Well, the reason I read it was because I'd been told that there was some confusion in the way that the inquest had been asking questions and so on, and I made my own decision that I wanted to read it. I'm not quite sure how I actually managed to prioritise the time to do this, but I did, and I remember that being an extremely long document, and I read it from start to finish. And I remember thinking that Brian was very expert and that he was teasing his way through some pretty complicated issues, and I could see a bit of what, at least I thought I could see, I'm not a technical expert, I could see a little bit of what the team was saying, that some of the questions seemed to be coming from slightly different angles, and I could see that he was trying to explain. And I overall formed the view that he was very expert and had actually given helpful evidence to the inquest.
Right.
I mean, I remained, having read that transcript, still slightly confused about all of the various layers of regulations that applied to the Lakanal House building that had been built up over the years.
Yes.
To the question of the cladding and the panels and the relationship between the two. And I didn't try to resolve all that confusion in my mind because that wasn't the purpose of what I was doing. I was trying to understand. Okay. And in the end, as I said, in my witness statement, I concluded that we needed a full-scale review, and I wasn't the only one to conclude that. The Secretary of State was in the same place.
Yes. Now, in that last sentence of that paragraph that we read, you said you were struck by that your predecessors had not had any inkling of the problems that were now coming to the surface. Can you just be specific? What were those problems that were coming to the surface now?
The problems of non-compliance with the building regulations and the approved documents.
So
lack of
people
regard
failing
the
to
approved
comply
documents.
with those?
Yes.
Right.
By the Wednesday after the fire, a week after the fire, we knew that there were 3 other buildings that had ACM cladding. And with each sort of 12, 24 hours that went by, we had some more. And they kept coming through. It was 5 and it was 9 and it was 13 and by the weekend it was 25 or 30. And those were extremely chilling moments for us when that information came through. I mean, we were horrified, actually, because it meant that this wasn't a one-off.
Yeah.
And quite what that would mean was unclear at the time, but it was an unbelievably sobering moment inside the department. And so it was those issues that were not, when I then spoke to my permanent secretary, former colleagues, late, I think it was after we knew that I was speaking to them. So it was that sort of issue that I think I meant when I was writing that statement.
Yeah. When did it become clear to you, if at all, that there might actually be a problem with the regulations and the guidance that had been given themselves, not simply a question of failure to comply, but actually a lack of clarity or even worse with the guidance? When did that become clear to you?
Well, there were claims to that effect within a few days of the fire. I can't remember exactly when, but I'm sure before the first weekend. And I and the Secretary of State were both quite concerned to understand whether the documents themselves were part of the problem or whether they weren't. And there were quite a lot of debates in those first days about whether the documents were clear that this sort of cladding should not be on a high-rise residential building. And the team were very clear it shouldn't be, but there was more ambiguity coming from the industry. And on the Tuesday, I think, after the fire, I sat down with the team, with Brian Martin, and also actually with Nick King, the Secretary of State Special Advisor, who's a very able Special Advisor, and we just went through that bit of the approved document, and we had it explained to us. Our lawyers were there as well, and we just discussed what it meant, and we took that whole question of the word filler, whether it helped or whether it didn't, and that was my own personal sort of exploration of those issues. But we also took legal advice and overall formed the view that, I mean, clearly the coroner had said these documents were not easy to use, and our own usability study, as I now know, I'm not sure I knew this at the time, had been, I think, quite hard-hitting about how unusable the documents were, actually not very long before. But when I read that quite short set of paragraphs, I couldn't really see why it was difficult to understand that combustible cladding was okay to put on a residential building of that type. But given the warnings in the first paragraph specifically about cladding, I read that, and as a lay person, I found it quite hard to believe that you would read those paragraphs and think that it was okay.
Right.
And unless you'd done a full-scale test, and that what my understanding was that in order to believe that you could put that kind of cladding on a tall residential building, you would have had to have worked extremely hard to find your way round the language. And why would you do that?
Right, yes. Was there a later stage at which you came to realise that the guidance perhaps wasn't as clear as it ought to be?
Well, by that stage, even I think that quite early stage, but certainly once we began to get the test results back, I began to be much more worried about the wider system and the documents as part of that. So at the beginning, in the first few days, the focus of ministers and the questions that we were asking and answering were on, are the rules clear and are they right? And what's going on the enforcement side. And what I felt, once we got about a week after the fire, that it was everything else that was worrying me almost even more.
Yeah.
So whether or not the regulations were clear, I thought they were at high level. I couldn't really understand why, structural engineers and architects could have why that could have been so confusing, but I believe that people were confused, but for me that spoke to system issues of responsibility and accountability and oversight and training and all of the things that Judith Hackett's review uncovered, as well as the regulations themselves. So I thought it was right to broaden the question, is what I'm saying. Sorry, rather long-windedly.
No, that's fine.
Rather than just focusing on the regulations themselves. So I don't recall having any further meetings that discuss the detail of the regulations or the approved documents, I mean. Really,
Okay, that's helpful. I'm going to come back to some of the meetings you had, including the one with Mr. Martin, in a moment, possibly this afternoon. Just in terms of this paragraph and what you told us, you said that you spoke to several of your predecessors. Who else did you speak to? We know you spoke to Sir Bob Kerslake. Who else did you speak to?
I spoke to Sir Richard Mottram, who had been Permanent Secretary from around 1998. I spoke to Mavis MacDonald, who was Permanent Secretary after him until the early 2000s. Mavis had worked in the department for 40 years and was steeped in its history and its work. And I spoke to Peter Housden, who was her successor and who had worked in local government like Bob Kerslake, although without the depth of housing.
Yeah. And just in brief, were any of them aware of systemic problems with the building regulations system or the building control system?
No, they were very short conversations. I had sought to get to know all my predecessors when I arrived in the department, because I always approached new jobs by getting involved in the history and trying to understand it. And as part of that, I had lunches and dinners with all of my predecessors on a number of occasions. So I had the relationships already there. And so we got quite quickly to what did you know? Were these ever issues when you were there? And I raised some of the specific fires, Garnet Court and so on, with, I can't remember which permanent secretaries were there at different times, but I raised some of those files. I mean, what about that? Do you remember that? Do you remember what we did after that? And the overwhelming message was, I just don't remember any of this. It wasn't something that was particularly brought to my attention. And I found that quite chilling, to be honest.
Yeah. Now, if we can look back at your third statement, it's a sentence that we read before, but I want to pick you up on it now. If we go to CLG 30839, your third statement, page 4, paragraph 10, you say in the first 3 lines, it was immediately clear that the department had not met the promised timescale for publishing a revised version of approved document B of the building regulations by 2016-17, although much of the preparatory work had been completed. Do you see that?
Yes.
And you say something similar, although not quite the same. If we go to page 11 and look at paragraph 30, we seem to have a bit of a problem. Oh, here we go. Yes, at paragraph 30, you say there, as described in paragraph 10 above, by the morning of Wednesday the 14th of June, it was clear that the department had missed its deadline of 2016-17 for publication of the revised approved document B, although much of the work had been completed. So in one part of your statement, you're saying much of the preparatory work had been completed. In another part, you're saying much of the work had been completed. Are you drawing a distinction between preparatory work and work there, and which do you mean?
I wasn't intending to draw a distinction in my witness statement. And the information I had at the time was what I'd been told only at that very early stage. So I think I must have been told that we were ready to consult, that we'd done some of the research. I think I would describe that as preparatory work, because the consultation had not yet been actually launched.
Yes.
But most of the work would have been preparatory work, so in my mind there isn't an enormous difference in the inclusion of that extra word.
Yes. Does it remain your understanding of the position that much of the preparatory work had been completed on publishing a revised version of approved document B before the Grenfell Tower fire?
Yes, working on the basis of the information I had at the time, and I mean, how much is much, but I mean, I know they'd done the research, and that was actually concluded in early 2015, I think. I know that now, I didn't know that at the time at that level of detail.
No. What was it that you had understood had been done? Was it just the research work had been done?
Do you know, I can't really remember. I mean, if you're asking me what did I know on Wednesday, the 14th of June in the morning, the answer is not very much.
No.
I think I was told we've done most of the work and we're ready. We've got a document ready to go, and that would suggest we were quite well advanced in the work, and that's what I would have assumed. But
Yes.
I don't think I knew then about the research and the usability study or any of the detailed preparations that had been done.
Yes. Can we agree now that, in fact, the evidence shows that the work was very far from being completed and was many years behind where it should have been?
Yes, yes, we can. I mean, I think the department was not even consulted, so that was going to take quite a while, and then the document would need to be revised again. So it was some months away,
Yeah.
and I must have been told a little bit of that to be so clear, because I was pretty, trenchant in my view that we had missed the deadline. And if it was only a question of 2 or 3 months, I think I would have thought, well, that's not great, but
Yeah.
But I think I must have known that it was quite seriously delayed.
Yeah. Were you told that the Housing Standards Review had delayed this work from even really starting in earnest until mid-2015?
No, not at the time. I wasn't told that.
Were you aware that the research work, were you aware that the research work which had been commissioned and which was an important part of the review was not even published by the time of the Grenfell Tower fire?
No, I was not aware of that.
And was not published until February 2019?
Yes, I mean, after the fire, everything was paused and looked at through a different lens, but I'm aware now that was a very long delay, because the research was ready, I think, in February 2015.
That's right. A discussion document was not published on the review of Part B until March 2017. Were you made aware of that?
Well, I wasn't aware of any of the details, no, but I'm aware now.
And a usability survey had been completed and was published in February 2017. Were you aware of that?
Probably not on the morning of the fire, no.
Yeah. Were you aware that by the time of the Grenfell fire, a formal Part B working group had still not been established?
No.
No impact assessments had been completed prior to the Grenfell Tower fire. Were you aware of that?
No.
Were you aware that no public consultation had taken place on any revisions prior to the Grenfell Tower fire?
No. I mean, I wasn't aware of the work at all, so, I wasn't aware of all the different phases and stages and where they got to.
Yes. But can we agree now that it was certainly not the case that much of the work had been completed, even if some of the preparatory work had?
I honestly don't draw much of a distinction between preparatory work and work. I think I basically meant preparatory work, and a lot of it hadn't been completed, but it hadn't been sufficiently far progressed, and there were a lot of stages still to go.
Yes. Mr. Chairman, I know there's a couple of minutes to go, but I was about to turn to a different topic, and this would be a good moment
I think
for the
we
break.
can afford to give away a couple of minutes.
Thank you.
Well done, Melanie. We need to stop about this time so that we can all have some lunch. And so a couple of minutes early, that won't hurt. So we'll break there. We'll resume, please, at 2:00. And as before, I have to ask you not to talk to anyone about your evidence or anything relating to it. All right?
Thank you.
Thank you very much. You'd like to give the usher, please? Yes, thank you very much, Miss Grange. 2:00 then, please.
Thank you.